Hello, today on my channel you will hear an amazing story about life. I hope you enjoy this story. This one struck me to the core. Honestly, I still can't forget it. Enjoy watching.
Veronica walked down the street, carefully avoiding the puddles left by the recent rain. Her mood was foul. The owner of the rented flat had raised the rent again, although she had vowed not to do so for at least 6 months. Well, how could she not, Veronica? "I can't rent the place out at a loss," said Mrs. Vanessa. "Anyway, I'd like to change the wallpaper. Your kids have ruined it." Veronica looked at her doubtfully. "Mrs. Vanessa, what makes you think my children did it? I don't think your flat was very nice to begin with, but it suited me." The landlady squinted at her. "Well, my dear, I should know better who did it. And if you don't believe me, I have proof. I've got a hidden camera in the flat, so you can't fool me." Veronica's cheeks flushed with indignation. "What do you mean, a hidden camera? Have you been examining me like an insect under a magnifying glass all this time?" Mrs. Vanessa wanted to say something unpleasant, but stopped halfway through, realizing that she had said too much. "Well, don't pout, I just installed it in the kitchen to keep it under control. You know, things happen. Suddenly the tenant at my place drinking alcohol in my absence, and then my flat burned down. I don't need such happiness for nothing." Veronica looked regretfully at the landlady. "How are you not ashamed to talk about such things? I have 3 children, if you forget, what alcohol, and I've never had guests. Well, I'm not an X-ray to see through people. Trust but verify, as they say," said Mrs. Vanessa, grudgingly. When Veronica caught the uneasy note in her hostess's voice, she didn't want to escalate the situation and tried to bring the conversation to a halt. She had no other place to live. It would take time to find something more or less acceptable. But that was exactly what Veronica didn't have. She worked for the 7th month in the company wife for an hour, which provided cleaning services to clients. In general, she liked the work, a constant change of scenery. The clients are always different. Richly decorated houses attracted the eye with their luxury. Gathering in such rooms, Veronica imagined that one day she would be the owner of such splendor. Of course, it was all just a dream, a fantasy that would never come true under any circumstances, although dreaming is always more pleasant than realizing the harsh reality. Entering the company's office, Veronica was practically nose to nose with the boss, Mr. Oliver. "Veronica's here." "You late again? Or what?" Mr. Oliver asked. Veronica looked anxiously at the clockboard in the lobby and exhaled in relief. "You're joking again, Mr. Oliver. I've been setting 2 alarm clocks since that incident, so I'm not late anymore." The supervisor smiled. "All right, you can't make jokes, but I had my doubts. It's like children. You have 3, don't you?" Yes, Mr. Oliver, that's right." The twin boys, Clinton and Jeffrey, and the youngest daughter, Marion Veronica, looked at the chief suspiciously. Why is he interested in her children? Maybe some kind of bonus or gift? Although there are no holidays, she thought. Meanwhile, the boss continued his questions. "Why do you suffer alone? And why doesn't your husband help you?" At the mention of her husband, Veronica embarrassedly lowered her eyes. "What about my husband? We divorced as soon as Marion was born. The boys are not my own, they are adopted. We couldn't have children for a long time. We were desperate. Then one day we went to the cemetery to paint my mother's fence. I saw some kids about 6 years old walking between the graves and collecting food in their bags. But my heart trembled. I called them, gave them money and food. I also found out they were from an orphanage. So I decided to adopt them. My husband didn't seem to mind at first, but when I got pregnant, it was like he was off the chain. But I love my sons like my own, and they love me too." "Wow, you're a heroic mom. You don't see that very often these days. And your husband doesn't help you," the boss persisted. Veronica shook her head sadly. "What kind of help when Bill almost never stays anywhere for a long time, always without money, and himself in debt up to his ears? Marion's alimony was awarded, of course, but it didn't get any better. Still won't pay anything. He says I'd rather go to jail than support this load. Mr. Oliver nodded sympathetically, then said, "All right, Veronica, that's just lyrics. I've got a cleaning order, but it's a big one. I'm warning you, it's 2 floors plus a veranda, and I can't wait for anyone. We're already short-staffed. Oh, and before I forget, try to be as quiet as possible when you're cleaning. All right? Because Master Winston has a temper, and he's always giving me the creepy look. In general, behave like a mouse in his house, okay?" Veronica nodded in agreement. "All right, Mr. Oliver. We'll do everything in the best way possible." The warden smiled once more. "Good. I'm more than satisfied with that answer. But run along and remember, I'm counting on you." Letting this line past her ears, Veronica hurried to the specified address. Somewhere before, she had heard it before. "I'm counting on you, Veronica, at this moment." Without wanting to, Veronica remembered the exact situation in which the phrase had been uttered. It was exactly a year and a half ago, when she was working as a nurse in the surgery department. At that time, they had also tried to motivate her to work as much as possible. And then she was framed, accused of stealing a large sum of money from a patient's purse. Everyone was investigated, not just Veronica. But it was in her coat pocket that one of the large denomination notes was found with a pen mark, which was immediately recognized by the victim. The most upsetting thing for Veronica was that the note was important to the patient precisely because of this unfortunate mark made by the rich man's lover. A phone number, probably, and something else of special value to her. Of course, Veronica did not know how a small part of the stolen money ended up in her pockets. Most likely she was simply framed. But how can you prove your innocence when all the evidence is against you? She was dismissed from her job with a scandal, promising to do everything to make sure that she never again crossed the threshold of a medical institution as an employee. Naturally, the true culprit of the theft was never found. However, Veronica didn't care anymore. What's the use of talking when no one listens to you? At Winston's house, she noticed a massive building with 2 floors. It stood out from the rest of the houses on the same street. Outwardly, the businessman's house looked more like a museum than a dwelling. Cold marble walls, tiled roof, and huge windows overlooking a small garden where peacocks were strolling leisurely. A huge pool with a fountain in the middle of the garden deserved special attention. One could look at such things forever. To Veronica's surprise, the gate was open. After thinking for a while, she decided that it was a logical step on the part of the owner of the house. No matter how you look at it, but her visits were really waiting for her. And the cleaning wouldn't wait either. The only thing that was a little surprising was the lack of security. After all, the territory is large and there is not a soul around. Having passed a huge yard, Veronica approached the front door and carefully pulled the handle. Of course, it was unlocked. Veronica smiled and stepped inside. The large living room was the heart of the house. 3 huge sofas upholstered in beige silk velvet surrounded a gleaming lacquered antique oak coffee table. Narrow windows with lancet arches looked out onto the garden lawn, where plaster figures of animals, gnomes, and other fairy tale characters stood. Remembering that Mr. Oliver had asked her to be quiet, Veronica took off her shoes and slipped into the slippers she had brought with her. The cleaning supplies were in the designated area. Veronica knew that they had been delivered a little earlier to make it easier for the cleaning company employees. "Time to get started," Veronica whispered, and started cleaning. She still hadn't seen the occupants of the house in person, though that was most often the case. Employers leave a key and leave the house while they clean it, so as not to disturb them. But today, being in this house, Veronica felt uncomfortable. As she cleaned room after room, she kept catching herself thinking that she was being watched closely. But how Veronica did not know the answer to that question. Mr. Oliver had told the truth. The house was actually bigger. Finally, it was time to go to the study. Veronica gathered air in her chest and knocked just in case. She was answered by a tense silence. Then she heard a barely audible voice. "Come in." Veronica stepped cautiously inside and almost immediately met the gaze of a man in his early 50s. Winston's hair was solid gray, which spoke of his previous problems and difficulties. "Hello, I'm an employee of the cleaning company wife for an hour." Veronica introduced herself politely and set a bucket and mop on the floor. "I know who you are. There is CCTV installed everywhere in the house. So let's get this cleaned up quickly." Or I'm honestly very busy, the businessman replied in a voice completely devoid of emotion. It was obvious from Winston's face that he wasn't feeling very well. As he did so, Veronica noticed some papers on his desk with distinctive coats of arms and seals. She smiled and got down to business, wielding the mop deftly. Accustomed to such an environment, Veronica tried to ignore the client, thinking about her own thoughts in Winston's office. It smelled of medicine and something else that reminded her of foreign spices. Sunlight streamed through all the windows, literally illuminating the dust dancing in the rays. It was everywhere, on the leather sofa, on the antique paintings, on the oak desk piled with papers, and on the cupboard, whose shelves held many big and small financial secrets. Veronica loved the order she kept in this office, clearing away the clerical rubbish, wiping the dust off the books and furniture so she could hear the pleasant creak of wood under her hand again. Veronica, Winston's velvet voice came through. "That's your name, isn't it? Would you mind if I lay down on the couch? I'm not feeling well, and it'll make it easier for you to clean up." Veronica looked anxiously at the owner of the house, who, without waiting for her answer, had already laid down, covered himself with a warm plaid. "Of course I don't mind," Winston said, Veronica, alarmed at his unnatural pallor. "Are you feeling ill?" "Don't worry, I'm just a little dizzy," replied the businessman in a weak voice. "I have some papers in this cupboard that need tidying up. Would you mind dusting off the shelves and putting everything back?" Veronica nodded in agreement and walked over to the antique cabinet decorated with ornate carvings. Then she carefully opened the doors. The cabinet was full of files and boxes of documents. "Don't worry, Winston. I won't touch anything," she said. "I'll just put it away and dust it off." The businessman nodded and closed his eyes. Veronica set to work. From time to time, she noticed that some of the papers were very old, with yellow edges and faded ink. Their contents were more than just business documents. In some ways, they could be considered a history of Winston's life. There were copies of contracts, newspaper articles with pictures of the young businessman on the front page, and certificates of awards and donations. And then one very strange document caught her eye. It was not a simple typographical sheet, but rather an expensive parchment paper, sealed with stamps and signatures. Veronica immediately realized that it was a businessman's will. However, she did not read it. Instead, she took the document in her hands and turned to put it on the table. At that moment, Veronica tripped over the edge of the mat and awkwardly touched the carafe on the table, spilling water on the will. "Oh God," she cried, grabbing the paper. Veronica immediately tried to dry it by blotting it with paper towels. Unfortunately, the water had managed to leave wet spots on it. At that moment, Winston opened his eyes. "What happened?" he asked in a weak voice. "I spilled water on your document," Veronica said, feeling her heart racing. "What document?" Winston raised himself on his elbows and looked anxiously at the table. "I don't know exactly what it is, but there are notary stamps and signatures everywhere." "It's a will," Winston exclaimed, and a feverish gleam appeared in his eyes. Veronica turned pale. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to," she whispered. "I just tripped on the mat." "Yeah, it doesn't matter anymore," Winston said. His voice was hoarse with fatigue. "Whether you tripped or not, the important thing is that now my will is useless." Veronica involuntarily took 2 steps back, feeling guilty about what had happened. "I really don't know what to do now," she said tearfully. "I think you should leave me alone," the owner said without getting up from the sofa. "I don't need any more cleaning. You are free to go." "But I..." Veronica couldn't finish the sentence. "Come on, it's no big deal." "I'm going to call my family lawyer," Winston said. "He'll tell me what to do about the will. It'll probably have to be rewritten." Veronica nodded in agreement, feeling that her awkward actions had put the businessman in a bad light. "Anything else? I told you you're free to go. No help with the will is required." "I don't blame you. It's my fault." "I shouldn't have asked you to dust the cupboard," the businessman said tiredly with one eye closed. Veronica shrugged her shoulders in embarrassment. "No, I've got it all figured out. I'll be on my way then." Winston waved his hand. "Go on, Veronica. Don't worry about what happened. I won't mention it in the reviews." She nodded in agreement and headed for the door. Suddenly, a strange hoarse sound was heard behind her back. Veronica froze. The thought flashed through her mind that something was obviously wrong with Winston. She turned round sharply and immediately saw a frightening picture. The businessman was lying on the sofa with a glassy stare, and his face, twisted with convulsions, looked terrible. He was clearly gasping for air, trying to get air, but his airways were completely blocked by the swelling of his larynx. Veronica immediately realized that the owner of the house needed urgent medical help, which was certainly not available here and now. She was suddenly seized with panic. My God, what am I going to do? An ambulance. That's right, we need to call an ambulance. Veronica went to the telephone set on the edge of the table and started dialing the number with a trembling hand. But whether the machine was defective or she had dialed the wrong combination in her haste, the call had no effect. Tears glistened in her eyes as she remembered that she had forgotten her smartphone on the nightstand at home. At that moment, she became genuinely scared. Hey, is there anyone here? Help, do you hear me? Truth be told, Veronica just couldn't get it into her head that a sick businessman was living all alone in such a huge house. And where was his family? His son, his daughter, his wife, after all. Meanwhile, Winston was getting worse and worse. The rapidly developing oedema had practically cut off the businessman's access to oxygen. Veronica felt for a pulse on the poor man's neck and quickly ascertained that he was still alive. She then lifted his head back to open his airway a little. Although this brought some relief to the host, still short of breath, there was no visible movement on his throat. Veronica realized that somehow the airway itself was blocked. The only option was a tracheotomy, creating an artificial opening in the trachea to allow air to flow into the lungs. As crazy as it sounded, Veronica had no other choice. At that moment, she remembered that a friend from surgery had told her about this extremely complicated procedure some time ago. Quickly taking a small clerical knife out of her desk drawer, she looked around for a disinfectant. Her gaze soon settled on a bottle of hard liquor, which was immediately put to use. Then, gathering air in her chest, she made a small incision in the area of the breathless businessman's Adam's apple. Barely restraining a scream, she inserted a biro into the hole so that it would not close. And at the same instant, there was the hoarse sound of breathing. Winston felt a little better, and his face began to take on a healthy color. Veronica wiped the sweat from her forehead. She was ready to faint at that very moment. In fact, she was not a surgeon, and her entire skill was only cleaning the floors in the surgical ward. But on the other hand, in life there are often situations when you have to act according to circumstances, and there is no time to think. Veronica's mind swarmed with thoughts of how she could help Winston until the doctors arrived. Fighting a panic attack, she ran out of the office and looked around for something that might help her. Suddenly, her gaze stopped on a smartphone lying on the windowsill. Most likely it belonged to the owner, or maybe it belonged to someone else, which didn't matter to Veronica right now. Praying to God that there was no lock on the phone, she tried to make a call, and miraculously she did. The emergency team arrived within minutes and Winston was rushed to a local hospital. Veronica, on the other hand, was interviewed by police officers to get to the bottom of what had happened. Overcome with excitement, she began to detail everything that had happened in the office. At that moment, a luxury foreign car stopped at Winston's house, from which got out a tall young man named Richard and his companion with long legs, Judy. As it turned out, the man was the son of a respected businessman, Richard, and his companion, Judy, was his fiancée. Richard was literally boiling with anger. His gaze was ready to burn the unfortunate cleaner, as if she was guilty of something shameful. After all, only a few hours ago, Veronica had saved her father when she had brought the sick man back to life with a quick and skillful movement. But Richard was blinded by prejudice and did not see her act as heroic. In his eyes, Veronica was just a technician, unworthy of his respect. "How dare you do that?" Richard hissed, his lips quivering with anger. "Who gave you the right to touch my father?" Veronica stood still, afraid to make a move. "I was just trying to help," she mumbled. "I could see he was getting sick." "Help," Richard shouted mockingly. "What are you, a doctor? You're a cleaner. You're nothing. Do you know what would happen if you were even a millimeter wrong? And there's no telling how it would end." Veronica sighed sadly. Her shoulders slumped under the weight of the accusations. In truth, she didn't know what to say to the angry young man. Richard was clearly against her, and no excuse could change his mind. "You could have killed him," Richard continued, his voice rising. "You're not a doctor. How dare you interfere?" "But I did help," Veronica said timidly. "And your father did feel better after I made the incision." "Didn't anyone ask you to do that?" Richard dismissed it. He'd have been out of it in 5 minutes. "Or did you think you were doing me a favor? You just wanted to show off for my father so you could extort money from him." Veronica's mind was reeling from the humiliation and the blatant lie. How could she say that without knowing the whole situation? She tried hard to hold back the tears that were choking her, not allowing her to concentrate. After all, she hadn't done it to ask for money. She just wanted to help someone who was in trouble. But Richard was too blinded by his pride to realize that. "Get out of here, you dirty little thing," he said coldly. "And don't you dare come near my father or our house again." Veronica nodded and stalked away. "You did the right thing," said Judy, Richard's fiancée, who had been silent the whole time, watching from the sidelines. Richard shook his head. "What else could I say?" "You're a healer," Richard said with a sneer. "What if that cut had made my father lose his voice? What if she'd hit the nerve endings?" And he patted Judy's fiancé on the shoulder. "Don't worry, everything will be fine. The main thing is that Winston's alive, and the rest is just petty stuff. Tell me, do you happen to know? He did not make a will?" Richard raised an eyebrow in surprise. "No, I don't think I've ever heard of such a thing. Why would I need a will? I'm the only heir. What's there to talk about?" Judy had a terrific smile. She really did. "I hadn't thought of that. You're 100% right, especially since it's my 3rd month." Richard's face brightened. "Oh, and when I think of babies, it's just so sweet. Tell me, why can't you come with me to the ultrasound?" "Well, I'm your husband." But she shook her head no. "Don't be naughty. You know I've already arranged it with Laura. I'll show you the video later and make a printout." Richard pouted jokingly. "All right, you're on, just for a little while. You need to be careful now. I'll look after my dad. This is weird. Why did he start choking? I checked with the ER doctor. He says the cleaner did the right thing. Maybe it was her who made him sick." And he looked at Judy ironically. In truth, she didn't care what happened to Winston. In her opinion, the businessman had long since become obsolete and therefore had to make room for others. She, for example, as her favorite daughter-in-law, or her son Richard, who in that case would still fall under her influence. Since there was no point in going back to the office now because of the late hour, Veronica went home. She felt like a squeezed lemon. The evening coolness pleasantly cheered Veronica up when she finally reached home. Opening the door with her key, she listened. The living room was quiet. But that didn't mean, of course, that the flat had been quiet all this time. That jubilation of children, like a miniature tornado, had already made a mess. A scattered construction set lay on the floor. A plush elephant missing one ear lurked a little further away. And on the coffee table stood an indestructible fortress made of cubes, with a plastic bucket on top. Veronica sighed. And not so much from fatigue as from the familiar realization that cleaning was waiting for her here too. Mummy's here." The children shouted and swooped down on her, piling on her from 3 sides. With difficulty getting out of their embrace, Veronica said, Now, my good ones, just take off my bag. We've been waiting for you. And we missed you already," the children sang almost in chorus, hanging on her like little kittens. Veronica smiled involuntarily. "I've missed you too, my good ones. How are you doing?" she asked, trying to keep her balance, as the children were magnetically attracted to her, clinging to her from all sides. "We were playing tower," Geoffrey announced proudly, pointing to the impressive structure. "Which we built," Clinton added hastily. "But Marion wanted to make us all tea. But Geoffrey and I refused. She's too young." At that moment, Veronica could not help but laugh. How cute and funny they were at the same time. All right, my little brigands? I'm going to start cleaning up now. And what are you going to do? She asked. We'll help. Of course we will. The twins shouted in unison. Only Marion mumbled something unintelligible. Veronica smiled. The help, of course, was doubtful. But then again, that was the beauty of motherhood. Well, if that's the case, then let's put the cubes in the yellow basket and the toys in the red one. Agreed? The kids immediately enthusiastically rushed to do their mother's tasks. In doing so, they were engaged in a competition, which was to see who could put as many cubes in the basket as possible. Jeffrey, don't throw the dice like that. You might hurt Marion, Veronica said. His mother's words had a calming effect on him. In fact, the kids were very obedient. It was just that in her absence they were possessed by a restless creature that made them naughty and mischievous. Mummy, I almost forgot. We've got a surprise for you, said Jeffrey proudly, and taking her hand, he led her into the kitchen. The children switched on the light, and Veronica gasped in surprise. On the table was one of her favorite dishes, mashed potatoes, fresh salads, a couple of sausages. What is this marvelous thing? She asked, still not believing her eyes. Jeffrey and I cooked it all ourselves, Clinton said proudly. We had our own internet recipes. At that moment, Veronica couldn't hold back tears of joy and gratitude, pulled the children to her and kissed each of them on both cheeks. You are my best cooks, Veronica whispered, barely holding back her tears. At that moment, the doorbell rang. Veronica frowned. Well, here comes the landlady again without warning. What does she want this time? Mrs. Vanessa slowly crossed the threshold. Her face was grim. Veronica felt with all her heart that something was wrong. Veronica, Mrs. Vanessa began, let's talk again about your accommodation. Did something happen to us? She asked anxiously. The thing is, this flat is my only source of income, and prices are going up, said Mrs. Vanessa, and I'd like to raise the rent. Veronica turned pale. She was already saving every penny she could to pay the rent. She could barely make ends meet. Mrs. Vanessa, Veronica began. I'm in a very difficult situation right now. I'm barely making ends meet as it is. I understand, Veronica, she said, but what can you do? In that case, I'll tell you what I'll do. Veronica looked at Mrs. Vanessa warily. What is it? Well, Veronica, I won't beat round the bush, said the landlady, but you must marry my son Norman. If you do, the rent will remain the same. Veronica's breath caught in surprise. Mrs. Vanessa, how is that possible? We don't even know each other. I know, Veronica, the woman replied. But Norman's situation is very bad right now. He needs a wife and children right away. How can I put it? For extenuating circumstances. Why? Veronica asked warily. Oh, what difference does it make? Caught stealing, the landlady said without blinking an eye. And now you need some hard evidence for the court. So he was forced to steal to feed his 3 children. The landlady said without blinking an eye. And you just need to be his wife. For appearances, no innuendo or lovemaking. I don't need that many grandchildren for nothing. At that moment, Veronica saw in her eyes a cold calculation coupled with despair and fear for the fate of her only son. A thief, a drunkard, a son, but still a son. Mrs. Vanessa, Veronica began, but at that moment Marion came running out of the room. Mummy, she shouted. Jeffrey broke my toy. Marion, Veronica said sternly, please go back inside and we'll talk later. But Jeffrey took my toy away from me. Her daughter continued to whine. Veronica shook her head and looked at Mrs. Vanessa. What if I refuse? What if your offer is unacceptable to me? The landlady smiled enigmatically. And then, darling Mrs. Vanessa said, you're in for a nasty surprise. You probably don't know it, but I've already drawn up a report of your children's damage to the property and home. Yes, yes. And don't look at me like that. The report is complete, and if you refuse, you're going to have to pay me to fix the place up. You hear me? Full repairs? What are you talking about? Veronica exclaimed. I've only been renting this flat for 6 months, and it was in a state of disrepair even on the day I moved in. Mrs. Vanessa tensed. You're not very good on me, sweetheart. Do you want to try your luck? Go ahead, but you'll still have to pay the money for the repairs or live with my son until he settles his problems in court. It was only now that Veronica realized she'd walked into a real trap. There really was no way out. Mrs. Vanessa's a con artist. She'd probably set it up so that everyone but herself would have to take the blame. Not knowing what to say, Veronica promised to think about it. At the same time, she realized that she had almost no time to think. All right, darling, I'll come round tomorrow. Just don't do anything stupid, said Mrs. Vanessa. All right? We're adults, aren't we? 'Cause I could go to the social services if I need to. What's Social Security got to do with it? Veronica asked in a shaky voice. The hostess again replied with a wry smile. Well, it has something to do with your children suffering, doesn't it? You work as a cleaner, and the children are hungry 24 hours a day. And when you get your salary, you drink it in a matter of days. You lead an immoral life and survive on the children's allowance. Tears glistened in Veronica's eyes. At that moment, she was ready to just tear this con artist with her bare hands. It's not true. Why are you doing this? Veronica whispered, struggling to pull herself together. Mrs. Vanessa shook her head. Well, what else could it be? Sweetheart, if you can't understand normal words. They give you a carrot, and you're always asking for a stick. Yes, a good carrot the son, a slacker, a convict without 5 minutes, thought Veronica. But she didn't say it out loud. Instead, she said goodbye politely, and finally escorted the landlady out of the flat. Sweat broke out on Veronica's forehead. To say that she was surprised was not to say anything, but what was she to do now? Quarrel with Mrs. Vanessa completely, put herself and the children at risk, or accept her proposal and tolerate this sham marriage? Of course, both decisions were unpleasant for her. But still, Veronica was leaning in favor of the second. After all, she loved her little ones more than anything else in the world. At the same time, Winston woke up in a hospital room, surrounded by unfamiliar faces and alarmingly beeping monitors. His body felt light but lifeless, and his head throbbed with an annoying throbbing noise. But worst of all was the realization that he couldn't breathe on his own. The choking attack had robbed him of the ability to make sounds, and his pleas for help were drowned in the silence of the hospital room, in the fog of Winston's mind. Every now and then, vague images surfaced. He remembered the bleary-eyed cleaning woman who had been there at the critical moment. Despite her trembling hands and panic, she had found the strength to save his life. Memories were gradually forming into a mosaic, and the image of Veronica, his savior, became more and more distinct. He wished he could see her now, to thank her for what she had done for him. At the same time, the businessman was not at all angry that she had flooded his will with water. No big deal, he thought. He would write a new one. Winston's thoughts were interrupted by the creak of the door opening. A tall young woman in a white dressing gown entered. Her face was as if carved in marble, and her eyes radiated cold intelligence and calculation. It was the doctor who had come to speak to him. Winston Terrence, Mrs. Candy said in a well-practiced voice. Are you glad you've come to your senses at last? I have something important to tell you. Do you understand what it is? Even though the choking attack was controlled in time, wasn't it? You're in danger of losing your voice and becoming mute. The damage to your upper respiratory tract was more severe than we realized, and they started much earlier than the choking attack itself. The doctor's words sounded like a judgment dumbness. It was tantamount to a slow death for him. A once outgoing and eloquent man who could go on stage during meals and sing something for the soul. And Winston couldn't imagine his life without the ability to speak, to make deals, to negotiate, which had once paved his way from an ordinary office clerk to the celestials of financial Olympus. At that moment, panic gripped his heart. He looked at the doctor with helplessness in his eyes, hoping to see a glimmer of hope. Winston wanted to scream in despair, but only a barely audible wheeze came out of his mouth. Don't despair, said Mrs. Candy. We'll hope for the best, but you should be prepared for the possibility that the voice may not come back. It's too early to pick up the phone, but don't be discouraged. We'll be starting you on a rehabilitation program soon. I hope it helps. With these words, she left the room, leaving him alone with his distress. Winston closed his eyes, feeling his hope crumble like a house of cards. He felt trapped in his own body, a prisoner, condemned to silence in a world of colors and sounds. Thoughts raced through his mind, trying to find a way out of the situation. But the answer was slipping away like a mirage in the desert. At that moment, he suddenly remembered his son Richard and his wife Judy. After all, they were the ones he had named in his will. And Winston had only included Judy when he learned that she was pregnant with Richard's child. How could he not, he thought. When did Judy become part of their family dynasty? Oh, what if she had a grandchild, or 2 grandchildren? That would be a joy. Wasting no time, Winston scribbled a few words on a piece of paper and handed it to the nurse who entered the room. "Bring my son." She read it, looked at the patient in surprise, and then walked out, closing the door behind her. Of course, Winston realized that Richard would not come to him at a moment's notice, and so he sank into sad memories. The quiet humming of the ventilator brought the businessman back to reality. In addition to the patient's will, his thoughts brought him back to his distant youth, when he was a completely different person. Then Winston, a penniless student, worked part-time as a singer in restaurants to somehow make ends meet, and he was always surrounded by a swarm of admirers. But only one girl stood out from the rest. Her name was Beatrice. She grew up in a poor family. Her clear, high voice and gray, slightly sad eyes captivated him once and for all. One day after his next performance, Winston approached her and asked her out. To his amazement, Beatrice happily agreed. They walked along the narrow alleys of the park, holding hands and chatting about everything in the world. Beatrice's voice flowed like a song, drawing Winston into a sweet world of dreams. She told him about her dreams, her plans for the future. In turn, Winston was struck by the sincerity and kindness of the girl. Soon their dates became frequent. True, they met secretly, fearing judgment from Winston's family. In this case, the parents of the guy were not rich. Not at all. Just in social terms, they were noticeably higher Beatrice, who was brought up by her grandmother. Meanwhile, the feelings of the 2 lovers blossomed into a lush flower, fueled by the burning passion of forbidden fruit. Unfortunately, as it usually happens on the path of love, there was an insurmountable obstacle in their way: the parents of the groom. They specifically forbade their son to communicate with Beatrice, threatened to disown him if he resisted their will. But the guy did not go about it, intending to fight to the end. And then Winston's father, Mr. Terrence, decided on a desperate step for a heart-to-heart talk with the chief military commander of the city. His father agreed that Winston would be taken into the army, and not somewhere, but to the Navy, where he would definitely forget about his Beatrice. Naturally, the young people knew nothing about it. Beatrice, wishing to reconcile Winston with her family, kept asking her to wait. Due to her naivety, the girl sincerely believed that in time they would be able to persuade her parents to consent to their union. But time was not among their allies. Winston, driven by the desire to succeed and prove his worth to the family, Beatrice diligently studied, worked, not knowing that his father has already decided everything for him. Winston sang hoarsely, hoping that his natural talent would bring him fame and fortune. But ahead of the guy was waiting for his father-initiated expulsion from the institute and 3 years of service on a submarine. Unfortunately, Beatrice stopped writing letters to Winston immediately after he got into the army. What happened to her afterwards, no one knew. As the years passed, Winston served and returned to his hometown, where he reached unprecedented heights in business, becoming one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the world. But his heart still belonged to Beatrice. All this time, the businessman tried to find it, but all his attempts were in vain. Beatrice seemed to vanish into thin air. Of course, the wolf loner Winston did not become a loner, and a year after the demobilization married a former classmate, Molly, who gave birth to his son Richard. But this marriage lasted only 12 years, after which the couple divorced, not feeling for each other, absolutely no feelings. The richer and more powerful Winston became, the more longing for the bride from the past ate him from the inside. Deep down, Winston knew he had lost true love because of his selfishness and fear of falling out with his parents. If he had put love above his ambition, they could still be together now. And now, lying in a hospital bed, Winston was faced with the harsh truth. His business wealth is all an abomination compared to the immense love he lost in his youth. And Winston also feared that his voice, his body, his reputation were at risk because of his illness. Everything could be ruined. Most of all, he feared the thought of never being able to sing again. Singing was his passion, connecting him to the world of art, where people without talent are forever barred from entering. Without a voice, Winston would be but a mute shadow of his former self. In the darkness of the chamber of happiness was not visible, and bitter tears flowed down his cheeks. He mourned for lost youth, lost voice, and lost love. Through his tears, he mentally whispered the words of an old song he had once sung for Beatrice. Will she ever hear it again? Will he ever get another chance to right his wrongs? Or will his life remain a tragic love song? To this question, Winston knew no answer. Time after time, he had spent huge sums of money on private investigators trying to find traces of Beatrice, but all was in vain. Either the detectives simply drained him of money like leeches, or Beatrice really disappeared without a trace. While Winston reminisced about his past, his son Richard happily watched the video report. The ultrasound room said it's going to be a boy, she said with a smile. Richard's eyes lit up with a sly twinkle. That's a royal gift, he said. Why is it so bad and blurry? I can't see you at all. Judy frowned. You're such a baby. Don't you know Laura? She's always got her hands in the wrong place. You can't even find a smartphone. The quality's a mess. Catching a hint of irritation in her words, Richard backtracked. So what if it doesn't change the point? In 6 months, I'll be a happy dad. What could be better than that? That evening, Veronica stayed up late. Tomorrow, the young mother was to meet Mrs. Vanessa's son, Norman, who she already disliked in absentia. The night passed in anxious expectation of a change in the warm weather. In the morning, sunlight streamed through the curtains, as if flirting with the slumbering woman. Veronica sighed tiredly, threw off the blanket, and got out of bed. Another day was beginning, a day filled with taking care of 3 small children, laundry, cooking, cleaning, and lots of other small and large family chores. But today was a special day, for Veronica was to meet Norman, experiencing great inner turmoil. She made tea, put porridge on the cooker, and tried to forget that today something would happen in their small house that would turn her life upside down. Mentally, the young mother even promised herself that she would try to behave confidently without showing Norman her fear. Suddenly there was a knock at the door. She felt an unpleasant chill run down her spine. Veronica poured herself a cup of tea, took a deep breath, and went to open the door. On the threshold stood a tall, thin man, swarthy, with stiff black hair and piercing brown eyes. He looked older than his years, especially with the dark circles under his eyes and the scar near his upper lip. Norman was wearing a black windbreaker and crumpled jeans, which only added to the negativity of his image. I'm here, he said somewhat gruffly. Veronica felt a wave of anxiety surge through her body. Come in, she said, trying to hide her excitement from her guest. Did your mother tell you that you are to live here now? Yes, why? The guest asked defiantly. Nothing, Veronica nodded. I know about everything and I'm ready to help. I have some things here, Norman continued, and the tension in his voice increased. Can I drop them off? Veronica nodded and stepped aside to let him into the flat. I'll make your bed here, in the room across the hall, she said, realizing she was giving him 1 room out of 3. Good, Norman nodded, as if it were all natural and obvious to him. I don't want to disturb you. He strode noisily into the room, throwing a large rucksack on the floor. Veronica watched him half-heartedly, running through the most unbelievable thoughts in her head. Who was he really? What was in his head? What kind of neighbor would he be? You have children, don't you? Norman asked suddenly, as if he had read her thoughts. Yes, Veronica replied, her eyes fixed on the pictures of the babies on the chest of drawers 3. What are their names? She saw a shadow of sympathy flicker in his eyes, which immediately disappeared as if it had never been there. Not wishing to upset her guest, Veronica said the children's names one by one, spaced out. Norman remained silent, and the young mother realized that from that moment their lives were inevitably intertwined within the walls of this flat. I'll go to the shop, she said, trying to escape the tense silence. Do you need anything? No, not yet, Norman answered, a note of awkwardness in his voice. I can go to the shop tomorrow." Veronica nodded and left the room. Truth be told, she didn't want to be alone with Norman in this house. She wanted a breath of freedom to gather her thoughts and figure out what to do next. She bought groceries, returned home. To Veronica's great amazement, the children were running around the room, chasing a ball. "Mum, who is this uncle living with us?" Beatrice asked. "That's our landlady's son," replied Veronica, trying to find a logical explanation for what was happening. She made breakfast, trying to ignore the fact that Norman was sitting in his room and seemed to be watching her every move. The meal passed in complete silence, interrupted only by the sound of spoons and forks. "I want to talk to you," Norman said, rising from the table after the children have gone out. Veronica nodded, not knowing what to say to him. Deep down, she was afraid of his questions, afraid of the words he might say to her now. "I know you didn't want to live with me," Norman said in a calm voice. Veronica did not hear it as a reproach, but rather as sadness, and it calmed her a little. "I understand you. I know I'm no gift at all. But I really need your help, just for a little while. A month, or even 3 weeks, whatever works." She shook her head sadly. "Well, I don't mind. I know you're in danger of going to jail." "That's true," Norman nodded. "I'm in big trouble, but I'm going to get out of it with the least possible loss to myself." Veronica looked at him incredulously, but did not comment on his words for fear of a possible outbreak of aggression. From that day on, Veronica finally lost her peace. Now she expected some meanness or reproach from Norman every time. But he behaved quite decently. He did not come home drunk, and if he got drunk somewhere, he stayed there overnight. He did not offend the children. From time to time, he even bought them sweets. A week of living together flew by. Winston lay motionless with his eyes closed. His breathing was steady, though accompanied by the hissing of the ventilator. At that moment, a trim young man entered the room. Winston opened his eyes, trying to get a better look at the entrant's face. Finally, he succeeded. The guest was Stephen, the private detective whom Winston had hired a month ago to search for Beatrice. The businessman knew that Stephen had been forced to retire from law enforcement after being shot in the leg, resulting in the replacement of the damaged knee joint with an artificial implant. Stephen silently pulled a chair over to the patient's bedside and placed his bulky leather folder on the table. "I found her after all, Winston," he said. "But Beatrice, that is, she died about 15 years ago of a heart attack. True, she had a very different surname at the time of her death. She took her mother's maiden name, but she still had a daughter. She's all grown up now, though I haven't had a chance to talk to her yet." At this point, Stephen looked at the customer, as if expecting him to respond. But Winston's almost motionless face remained calm. Only his eyelids twitched slightly, indicating that the businessman's brain was in the midst of intense analytical work. "I'll do everything I can to let my daughter know about you as soon as possible," continued Stephen, breaking the silence of the room. "They say Beatrice raised her alone. Do you see where I'm going with this?" He felt the weight of the unspoken words pressing down on him, forcing him to take more active steps. "I have brought you a photograph of Beatrice's daughter," said Stephen, taking out of his pocket a photograph taken with powerful professional optics, secretly, from hiding, but very clear and of high quality. The detective then placed the photograph on the bedside table next to the bed. It showed a woman with the same facial features as Beatrice's, a look that was as delicate and as dear to Winston as she was. "She is lovely with ruddy cheeks and dimples. She is beautiful, just like her mother," said Stephen in a whisper, as if afraid to break the silence. At that moment, the detective looked at Winston and saw tears in his eyes. Stephen sat beside the bed for a while longer, gazing into Winston's pale face. At the same time, the private detective did not even realize that the patient was already familiar with this woman. "Her name is Veronica, isn't it?" Winston asked meaningfully. "Veronica, an employee of the company woman for an hour, who saved him from suffocation, depriving him of the ability to speak." A couple of days later, Winston saw Veronica for himself. True, now he immediately recognized her as his first love, Beatrice. Though he could not do so the first time, being immersed in the drafting of his will. And Winston also saw the smile that he liked Beatrice so much, and the mischievous gleam in her eyes. The businessman felt his heart begin to beat harder, but he could not say a word. "Winston has a hard time talking," Stephen explained to Veronica, though it was unnecessary. "He's had an operation." She nodded. Immediately she realized that Winston couldn't communicate, but still wanted to tell her something very important. "I understand," Veronica said. "I can wait for him to speak." She was silent for a moment, then added, "I can even come again, with the children." Stephen nodded. He saw Winston looking at Veronica, and his eyes were full of anguish and deep longing. She stepped closer to her patient, smiled at him, and tears glistened in her eyes. "I know Mum loved you very much," Veronica said slowly. "I've heard about you from her. I didn't know your name, but I want you to know that my mother was happy with you." Winston nodded discreetly. At that moment, the businessman felt his heart fill with warmth and happiness. He saw in Veronica's eyes the same tenderness that had once been in Beatrice's eyes. And the businessman also realized that he didn't need to say a word for his daughter to understand his feelings. After all, she was the one. And the timeline confirmed it. And so did the DNA test, which they had done by mutual desire. In the days and weeks that followed, Veronica became a frequent visitor to Winston's room. She brought Marion, Clinton, and Jeffrey, who enjoyed drawing colorful pictures for Grandpa and even reading poetry aloud. At first, upon learning of this, Richard resisted, trying to break up father and daughter. Most likely, it was the usual jealousy inherent in most children, regardless of their age and social status. But then the son of a businessman did not care about family disputes, especially when it turned out that Judy all this time deceived him and was not really pregnant. The cunning beauty skillfully lied to her chosen one in order to get him to the wedding as soon as possible. Fear and fictitious pregnancy was the trump card up her sleeve, which she was going to play in the near future. Without knowing it, Veronica had accidentally spoilt the businessman's will, in which Judy's name was on a par with his son's. And so, it was thanks to this coincidence Veronica saved Winston from a rash decision in favor of his daughter-in-law. But that was all in the past now. Now Veronica was telling her father about her life, about her work in the company wife for an hour. Winston, despite his lack of voice, felt happy and kept up his good behavior. Observing the life of his daughter, he became more and more convinced that Beatrice's efforts were not in vain. After all, she left behind a beautiful heiress, who continued to live and enjoy life, despite everything. One day, Veronica once again came to her father in the hospital, holding a photo album containing pictures of her mother. Winston looked at the yellowed photos and wept silently. "My first love," Winston wrote in the notebook. "I know," Veronica said. "Mum told me a lot about how kind you were, how much she loved you, and how well you could sing." Winston smiled. At that moment, he felt truly happy. "Thank you, Veronica. Someday I'll sing to you," he wrote in his notebook, feeling his heart fill with warmth. And the businessman also realized that at that time, when parting at the fault of his parents with Beatrice, it was not his fault. After all, the first and naive love continued to live in their children, grandchildren, in everything that surrounded them in this life. A month flew by, during which Veronica's life changed beyond recognition. Having learnt about his daughter's problems with the landlady, Winston solved this issue by buying her a house outside the city with a view of the forest and the river. Thus, Mrs. Vanessa's son still had to stand trial for what he had done. Now, however, everything was fair, without deceit or innuendo. Richard made peace with his paternal sister and no longer considered her an enemy. Moreover, he began to spend a lot of time with his nephews, whom he loved with all his heart. Winston was lucky he was able to defeat the insidious disease. True, until the end of the voice of the businessman has not returned, because of which he was forced to constantly use a special sound amplifier, fixed in the area of the larynx outside. But he was not discouraged, because ahead of him awaited several extremely pleasant moments, the main of which was to be the wedding of Veronica and Private Detective Stephen, who after meeting in the ward experienced a strong mutual sympathy for each other. Deep down, the businessman believed that he could still sing on stage no matter what, and otherwise, when from the heights of heaven you are watched by your favorite woman, who also, as before, catches your every word and quietly sings along with her quiet, melodious voice. It was evening and the loud sounds of Indian melodrama could be heard in the house. The cheerful music sounded like a mockery. The wife of Camila's son, the lady of the house, had been doing chores late into the night. Now she was tearfully scrubbing the floors of the spacious four-room flat, and the music that played when they became husband and wife played in her head, and the words of the registrar came to mind. "Do you, Jennifer Johnson, agree to become the spouse of Nicholas Jones?" Why did she say yes? Gave in to her fiancé's entreaties to live with her mother. She put on a wedding ring, and that took her into a dark world of despair. Nicholas, indulging his mother in everything, didn't believe his wife. The miracle had not happened. Husband was not going to support and protect her in a difficult moment, and mother-in-law was dodgy, weaved intrigues, loaded unnecessary work, slandered on the daughter-in-law. Not the difficulties of family life frightened Jennifer. Offended Nicholas misunderstanding, the injustice of life. And today she scrubbed the floors for the second time, only because the mother of her husband did not believe her that she had already cleaned the whole house in the early morning. In the evening, Nicholas supported his mother, not understanding why his wife is stubborn and cannot do simple housework. Finished with the cleaning, Jennifer quietly snuck into the bathroom and closed. Here she could let her feelings out, rest from the family burden. The well-appointed flat, unlike her rural home, was a joy to bathe in at any time, without heating the cooker. It was a small consolation to Jennifer. She missed the peacefulness of the countryside, her yard, the warmth of communicating with the villagers. Picking up the water, with a snow-white cap of foam, she sank into the tub with pleasure. Once again, she remembered the carefree minutes of her unmarried life, and then the acquaintance with Nicholas and such a sudden wedding. Jennifer had fallen in love with the kind guy on a motorbike at first sight. Nicholas then came to visit his grandmother in the village. One day, driving through the village, he saw a marvelous girl with a black braid down to her waist, a gentle look, and a basket in her hands. It was a marvelous vision, as if a forest nymph had come out of the pages of books. She was walking with a basket of cloudberries, which she had been given by a kind-hearted grandmother for a letter from her son. Nicholas stopped, asked to treat him to a strange berry, which he had never seen before, so the relationship began. The guy surrounded his beloved with care and invited her to live in his luxurious four-room flat. Jennifer immediately disliked Camila, the city's spoiled woman, who did not like her son. Not one of her son's girls, she had worn out her cunning, and here was a gift from Nicholas, a simple girl from the village, an orphan from Kazan with no family and no tribe. Jennifer buried her parents long ago and lived poorly, alone. She worked as a postmistress, but at the insistence of her husband, she resigned and moved to the city. Why? What for? There was a persistent knock at the door. Camila's irritated voice brought her out of her blissful memories. "Jennifer, you're at it again. How many times have I told you not to shut the door, and how many times can you pour water? You haven't brought a penny into the house yourself. She's a madam, but she takes a bath every day. Open the door immediately, I have to go to the bathroom. I have a scheduled beauty treatment." "Mum, what's wrong?" asked Nicholas, who came running at the screams. "Your wife did not wash my room, I had to do it myself, and I have a backache, I feel sick. The medicine is in the bathroom, I've been trying to persuade her for an hour and she refuses. And she was rude to me. Talk to your wife." "Why are you sassing me again, Mum?" "It's been 15 minutes and I've scrubbed the floors in every room." "No, look at you, you arrogant liar. Get out of my sight." Camila shoved her sister-in-law viciously in the side, causing her to almost fall over. Jennifer, Nicholas said coldly, "Stop arguing with your mom and show her some respect, please. If it's not too much trouble, Your Highness." He turned and walked away, stomping angrily. Day after day, her husband's mother nagged, making up tall tales, complaining to Nicholas about her deteriorating health, with such an ungrateful daughter-in-law. Jennifer baked pies, cooked French and Italian dishes, studied new recipes, watched videos on running a household. Nothing helped. The mother-in-law's main goal was to drive her daughter-in-law out by any means necessary. Kick her out for no reason, not her status. Nicholas is a prominent lawyer, and her late husband was a prosecutor. There were old connections, important people, not the last people in town. Camila was embarrassed by Jennifer, who didn't know how to handle cutlery, dressed gray, plain, and refused to go to salons. Unwillingness to do her hair and manicure pissed her off. When guests, the mother of the husband politely, but coldly owed her Girowetzia daughter-in-law telling her not to show anyone in front of her. A year of hard, tedious, joyless life passed. Jennifer took a job in a shop near the house as a clerk. Her husband stopped giving her money at her mother's request. At work, the daughter-in-law rested from the endless reproaches, but at home it became even worse. Now Camila reproached her daughter-in-law for her unwillingness to do household chores. "My dear, you are always at work, and my husband must be fed and looked after. I'll talk to my son so he won't let you get out of hand." "Mom, I do everything. I cook in advance, all my things are in order, I clean up morning and night. What's the fashion in which you insist on quitting your job? I'm ashamed you're working as a saleswoman with a husband like that. I'm ashamed of you. Because of you, Nicholas doesn't even leave me any money for the household, and I still have a house to keep in the village to pay the bills. Oh, Kazan orphan, you don't need to spend our money, you know that. Nicholas buys everything for the house." The arguments upset Jennifer. Later, the mother of the spouse reprimanded her son, as boorishly communicates his wife does not hear her advice. Jennifer was deeply hurt by Camilla's words that she was ashamed of her uneducated daughter-in-law. It was painful to remember why she never went to college. Jennifer was the pride of her parents. She graduated from high school with honors and planned to enter the medical academy. But a month after graduation, her parents were in a car accident on their way back from the city. Father died in the hospital, never regained consciousness. Mom fell into a coma. For 6 months, Jennifer traveled to all the hospitals, begging, hoping to save her mother, gave on the paw, begged to appoint an operation. The situation was hopeless. No one could help. Mom never woke up again. Having buried her mother, Jennifer was left an orphan. To live somehow, she worked part-time in a shop, then found a job at the post office. The road to the academy was closed. There was nothing to pay for her studies. Jennifer spent all the money she had saved on hospital and funeral expenses. The hard fate did not bother her mother-in-law. She could not allow a homeless girl from the village to run her house. Camila found a new way to get rid of her daughter-in-law. "Nicholas," she told her son, "we need an heir. Why can't your wife get pregnant?" "Mom, it's been so little time. Perhaps it's too soon to talk of children." "My dear, a child will help reconcile us all. It's such a blessing. I'll be so happy if you give me a grandchild." The cunning mother-in-law cried and hugged her son. "Okay, I'll talk to Jennifer. However, I agree, it's up to me." In the evening, Nicholas pleased his wife with his desire to have children. He didn't say anything about his mother's request. Camila went to extreme measures, which became known later. Jennifer rejoiced at the possibility of becoming a mom. A child could really soften her husband, and her life would be much happier. She had lived with the dream of having a child since her wedding, but it had not been possible to have children. Another 6 months passed. Jennifer cried as she held the test strip in her hands, disappointed again. Fear settled in her soul. Her mother-in-law would scream, her husband would support her mother and slam the door angrily. For the second month, he was less often at home. He stayed late at work, met with his mates. Camila was pleased. She had finally broken up the young people. There was one last step to take. One day, Jennifer entered the room and saw Nicholas, who sat with a twisted face of anger. When he saw his wife, he swung round and hit her in the face. "Ungrateful bitch," he shouted and threw a packet of pills at her. "How dare you lie to me and Mum? Explain to me, what are these?" "They're pills, but I've never seen them before." Crying with shaking hands, Jennifer read the instructions. They were birth control pills. The weight of the past months of endless humiliation, of frustration, came over her in an instant. She collapsed without feeling, no longer wanting to live and breathe in this cruel world of absurdity. Nicholas, though angry at his wife, felt guilty, could not bring her to her senses himself, called an ambulance. Camila snidely looked at the pills and indifferently escorted her daughter-in-law to the hospital. "Mum, why did she do this to me?" bitterly complained Nicholas, complaining to his mother. I told you. The hunchback will be corrected by the grave. Do not dare to forgive such a thing, divorce." "You can't do that, Mama. I promised her she'd be happy, but she lied to me too. I'm going to get up early in the morning to visit my wife and have a quiet talk." 3 days later, Jennifer was discharged. She took the bus home. Nicholas did not meet her. He was at work. Waiting for her at home was a suitcase and a note from her husband informing her that they were getting a divorce. Her mother-in-law was triumphant. She kicked Jennifer out without letting her wait for her husband. She was a country bumpkin, and she was still a country bumpkin. You shouldn't have messed us all about. Get out. I can't see you, you snake. You wanted to separate me from my son. It won't happen. Get out. I said get out. I want you out of here right now. The mother-in-law shouted after her, unwilling to stop her anger and triumph at the same time. In the evening, Nicholas learned that his wife had left. Mum, why didn't Jennifer wait for me? How dare she leave me? Why didn't she say anything? Calm down, son. It was her decision. Camila was careful not to mention the note she had written, copying her son's handwriting. But how? She didn't even leave a note. You two haven't been getting along for a long time. That woman is not good for you. Who's that redneck going to give birth to you? And without children, there's no family, it's an omen. If she did, who would she give birth to? There's no reason to breed without a native simplicity. Look for a wife of status. Having got rid of her daughter-in-law, Camila felt over the moon. She had achieved her goal. It was her plan. For a year, she drank Jennifer a decoction of wormwood, convincing her that this tea was good for women's health. So she hoped to make a young, healthy girl infertile, and then planted pills on her. Nicholas was upset, he thought. Jennifer hadn't forgiven him for the slap. With a longing in his heart, he walked around the room where he smelled her perfume. Sitting down on the bed, he went through the pills. A suspicion crept into his soul. The packets were intact, every single pill in place. Perhaps Jennifer hadn't taken them. He remembered hundreds of moments when his wife had cried and complained about her mother and he hadn't believed it. The load at the opening struck his heart with the pain of irretrievable loss. He himself, with his own hands, had destroyed love. There is no forgiveness, but Jennifer, his beloved, without whom so lonely and dreary will be able to understand. He would rent a flat for her, and tomorrow he would go to the village to beg forgiveness. An Indian song was playing loudly in the next room. Camila smiled blissfully in triumph. She was more at ease when others were suffering, but her carefree life would not last long. One day she would receive a letter that would turn her whole life upside down, change her character, teaching her to be compassionate, to empathize, to do good. And now she was far from even a moment's regret for her dastardly deed. Nicholas did not immediately get out to the small town where his wife lived before marriage. He had to see the client's case through to the end. A week later, he took a week's holiday and went to see Jennifer. As 2 years ago, to go decided on a motorbike to return the former feelings. He did not inform his mother about his departure. He was offended by her. He tried to avoid talking to her. Camila looked anxiously at her dejected son, hoping that time would heal him. She was already looking for a worthy match for him, an obedient socialite who will distract her Nicholas from sad thoughts. His mother repeatedly tried to talk about divorce, but the son waved away, avoiding an answer. Nicholas settled everything, packed his rucksack secretly from his mother and left the house. It was a clear spring day. Johnson happily set off on his long-awaited journey. Soon he would meet his beloved, whom he missed incredibly. It seemed to him that just today their family would open a new page of life. They would be happy, for he loved Jennifer so much. The road was slippery from the past rain. Prudently, Nicholas wore a helmet, but the wheels could fail. But it did not stop the desire to impress his wife, to revive pleasant memories, move the voice of reason. Johnson accelerated, feeling a rush of energy, freedom and lightness on his soul. It was a 2-hour non-stop drive to the small town. The road went without tarmac, not a living soul. After an hour and a half, Nicholas carelessly slipped into the oncoming lane. At that time, a tractor appeared from behind the corner. It was too late to brake. Nicholas jerked the wheel to the left. The motorbike rammed the bushes, crashed into a tree. The brakes did not work. The wheels began to slip. Johnson was thrown out of the saddle, and he rolled down the slope from the road. He was unlucky with the driver. The driver of the tractor was ex-prison inmate Kevin Reed, who would not want to be investigated again. He braked, hoping to save the arrogant driver, but Nicholas showed no signs of life. So Kevin took his belongings, got back on, and drove off, leaving the motorcyclist to die. In the village, he said nothing about the accident, not even a twinge of conscience. It was an accident. The fault of the tractor driver was not really his fault, and humanity, unfortunately, is inherent in few people. The mother missed her son the same day. She found out that he had taken a week's holiday and did not answer the phone. What a stubborn man, he went to his simple girl. Did she cast a spell on him? Camila knew where her daughter-in-law lived before her marriage, but she was not going to her. She decided that she would bear it for a week, and then she would see. She called her mother in the village and asked if her grandson had turned up. He hadn't. Her son's phone became unavailable, and after a week he still hadn't returned. She decided to go to the village herself, got to her mother, whom she rarely saw and communicated with even less often. The news was shocking. It had been a year since Nicholas had visited his grandmother, called Mrs. Cassandra. He hadn't come to the village a week ago, not yesterday, not the day before. "Do you know Jennifer, the postmistress?" Camila asked her mother. "She's your sister-in-law, your dear. Have you gone completely out of your mind?" The mother was silent, shaking her head. Something sly slipped into her gaze. "Jennifer hasn't been here in a year. She's moved in with you." "How?" "She's been divorced from my Nicholas for a fortnight. What better place to go than back home? She hasn't been here. We're next door to each other, 2 houses down." "Camila, don't make a mess. I know you. Where did you put the kids? They ran away from you, didn't they? They did the right thing." "I raised a bad daughter. You don't come here, you don't help your mother. If it wasn't for Nicholas, I'd be all alone. Mama, you never understood me, and I couldn't stand that simpleton. What use is she? I'm sorry, but I was raising my son. It was hard. He's back on his feet. He hasn't forgotten anyone, and he's my son. I raised him that way." "So you survived, Jennifer? I see you're a simpleton like me, or you've forgotten. What a character you have, Camila. I'm ashamed to have raised a daughter like that. Tell me what happened. Why did the kids run away from you?" "My son went to Jennifer's. I guess his motorbike isn't in the garage." "Where did it go?" "I don't know. I'm so sad." Camila couldn't hold back any longer. She clasped her hands and wailed. "Sonny, where are you, dear son? It's my own fault. My own fault. Let's go to Jennifer together. Maybe they're lurking there, living there. I'll tell you the address, but it's no use. I won't go. Go yourself and don't come back to me alone. It's easier and calmer. You go yourself, I'll call you if the children are found." Camila went to the address, but no one was home. She knocked. She went to the neighbors, but it was the same. Neither Jennifer nor her husband had been there for a year. Nobody had come or knocked. Camila went to the old habit to collect information in the town, in the shop, at the post office, at the club, but Jennifer as in water vanished. With a heavy heart, she returned to town, the trail broken. Acquaintances, friends didn't know where her son was. He never showed up for work. He didn't sign any resignation papers. Nicholas was irretrievably missing. The last desperate step was to file a missing persons report. Another year she padded the thresholds of government agencies, visited her mother in a small town. There was no trace of her son. Later, remorse seized Camila. Nothing could dull the pain of loss. It was impossible to believe in the death of her son. So she lived lonely, remembering the moments when everyone lived together, though not always friendly. Let him live with that simple girl, as long as he was near. Now the house was hopelessly silent. Camila cried at the window all day long with an absent look, but she believed that her son would return. The story by the roadside had a sequel. Nicholas survived. He was rescued by the family of a healer from a small town in the neighborhood where Jennifer lived. It was a very small town of just a few houses. The only people left in it were old people. For all the necessary food things, so small things for the household drove and went to the neighboring town. On that fateful day, the daughter of the Hilowi went to the shop on the road. First she saw a mangled motorbike, and a little further away she noticed Nicholas without feelings. What a grief, he must have crashed. What a handsome man he was. I sighed and shook my head. The girl, her name was Catherine, was trained in first aid, often helping her mother treat people. She checked and realized that the boy was alive, but it was not customary for healers to call an ambulance. They lived in the village as one family. In case of grief, they helped each other. So Catherine ran off to get help. Johnson was taken to Chloe's house. It wasn't good. The victim hadn't been conscious for a week. They searched around the motorbike, but they didn't find any ID. phone, or belongings. They were taken by a resourceful tractor driver so that there would be no trace of them at all. He just took the things, but he burnt all the papers and even his passport. There was a man, and he's gone, missing. The unknown man came to his senses on the 8th day. A black-eyed beauty with a thick red braid was sitting beside him. When she saw that the sick man opened his eyes, she jumped up and cried out, "Mummy, he's awake, come here." A not young but stately woman came in, bent over him and held his hand. "My dear, you'll live now. Where did you come from? What's your name?" But Nicholas was so weak that he could not speak. He shook his head, trying to say something, but could not utter a word. "Catherine, go and get him some broth and tea. I guess he can't talk. Maybe he'll write something later." The man thought with horror that he couldn't remember his name. Moreover, who he used to be, who he even was, he doesn't know. He frantically fumbled around, trying to get up, mumbled and fell again without feeling. Later, he was given tinctures. The men brought his motorbike, collected parts from it, and wanted to identify the man by it, but somehow forgot about it. It's no use, they thought. After all, the village had hardly developed. A kind man, we need him. If he doesn't remember his former life, it's his fate. Catherine nursed Nicholas, fell in love with him without memory. He was also charmed by this extraordinary, caring girl of fabulous beauty. Over time, Nicholas began to talk a little, turned out to be skillful at all hands. Quickly learnt to build, put a log cabin for his native Catherine, equipped it, and so they lived together. Vague pictures of the past came to mind, but the whole did not add up. With some secret excitement, he looked at the cloudberries, and then everything was eclipsed, did not go further memory. Nicholas was no longer himself. He was given a new name, Norman, the papers of a long dead man, buried and not registered as dead. Norman Carter was born. For a long time he couldn't remember where he came from, who he worked for, or why he was on that road. Camilla Jones was still waiting for her son's return. Her maternal heart told her he was alive. It had been 5 years since his disappearance. Nicholas had been reported missing. The bleak days had been hard. It seemed as if nothing would happen until she died, but one day she received a letter. A very strange message came from Jennifer's address in a small town. There was only one word on a white sheet of paper, Cloudberry. What the hell is this? The mother-in-law shook the envelope, nothing more, shone the leaf on the window a blank. I told you she was a mad fool. The same day I left for the village. The first thing I did was to go to Jennifer's house. She didn't remember her son's story about how he met his wife. This time the door to the house was open and empty inside. She walked through the rooms, as if no one lived there. Dust all around, cobwebs in the corners, the smell of a long uninhabited house. But in the midst of this emptiness, a brand new portrait of a sweet little girl stood on the windowsill. Camilla shuddered and cried, Nicholas's bottomless blue eyes staring back at her. Grabbing the portrait, she read the inscription at the bottom, Cloudberry on the back, Caroline Jones. It couldn't be that. How could it be? For 5 years I've been on my own, with my granddaughter growing up next to me. It was Jennifer, the wicked witch. She's the reason I lost my son and hid my granddaughter. What a bastard. Camilla howled as she looked at the photograph, stroked the face that bore the features of her precious Nicholas, and then sat down and wept. Tears of remorse poured down in streams. It was she herself who had driven the good girl away. She had given her wormwood to keep her from being a mother. But what a cruel fate. Jennifer's daughter was given to her, and everything was taken away from her. It's karma. Jennifer was wrong to do that. It was getting dark. There was no electricity in the house, so this was not where her daughter-in-law lived. Camilla stood up from the floor 5 years older, her heart bleeding. She walked to her mother's house and the door was open, wide open. No one inside, empty and desolate. She had not visited her mother for a year. She had given up hope of finding her son. She had stopped calling. Her mother had died without her. There's no one now, alone in the whole world. I'm sorry, Mom, I'm sorry. Where are you? Camilla clutched her temples and fell senseless. She woke up in the dark. There was a cold smell from the door. She had to find her granddaughter and Jennifer to find out what was wrong with her mother. There was no electricity in the house. She went into the kitchen. Like when she was a child, the candles were in a drawer. I lit them, put a glass, and sat alone in the semi-darkness on the chair where I sat as a small, carefree, mischievous girl 45 years ago. The glare played on the wall, the silence was incredible. The world froze here in an instant, in no hurry, no sacrifice required. What happened to her soul? The city had taken everything good out of her, made her a cruel and wicked girl. And it's not square meters, water from the tap that you need to stay alive. That's the feeling when you realize you're a real person. Only a small town can reveal the soul. Camila should have been born again, sitting alone on that chair, in the semi-darkness, which her mother had not thrown away because she had waited all her life for her daughter's return. In that moment, she came home with her whole soul. Grief helped her to realize the emptiness of her meaningless life. The clock ticked, as if counting down the time of rebirth. Night fell and business had to be postponed until tomorrow. Camila unraveled the prim bump on her head and braided her hair. She woke with the dawn in the morning, anxiously opened the wardrobe in her former room, going through the dresses she had worn when she was young. This was where she had lived until she got married and met a promising guy studying to be a lawyer. Later, they left the small town and bought a one-room flat in the big city. The clothes were too small, no doubt. I slammed the doors, went into my mother's room, opened the wardrobe. Weekend dresses hung in rows. Everything was in perfect order, even the perfume hadn't weathered off. By old habit, her mother walked around the village only in skirts or dresses. Camila stood in indecision. She dared not take her mother's things. It was not clear what had happened. It was bad enough to wear the things of the deceased, but she would certainly be told that her mother was dead. Emboldened by this thought, Camila chose a plain, straight-cut monochrome dress and changed. The trouser suit she'd arrived in was angrily tossed into the dresser, as if a frog had taken off its skin, transforming into a beautiful maiden. In her 50s, Camila was a slim, beautiful woman, but the strict outfits, dark things aged her. Now she was happily fidgeting in front of the mirror, as if rejuvenated a dozen years in this simple old-fashioned dress. It was time to make inquiries, stock up on groceries, put the house in order. I went outside, dizzy from the marvelous country air. I stood enjoying the ringing silence. I went into the neighboring house. I thought how I hadn't thought to go to the house since the evening. The old owner was milking a cow. She looked in, startled to see Camila in her neighbor's dress. "Hello, Mrs. Kimberly." "Don't you be sick," too, the old woman muttered quietly. "Tell me, where's Mummy?" "It's fate to die with a daughter like that." "No way." "You, my dear, don't deserve to know the truth," said the neighbor harshly, turning away. "Tell me, I beg of you, is she alive?" Mrs. Kimberly stood up, picked up the milking pan, and strode to the porch. The silence dragged on. "Now, you get out of here. I've nothing more to say, and don't come here and say anything more. It's up to you to decide how you want to live your life. Michael, get Blanca out of here and get this one out of here too." She mumbled under her breath, but Camila heard her. She didn't get anything else. Michael, the neighbor's son, passed by without a glance and didn't speak. Camila stood there for a moment, crumpled, and then walked angrily away. She passed 5 other neighbors, 2 of whom had already left the small town. The houses were padlocked, the vegetable garden abandoned in high summer, everything overgrown with grass. The other 2 neighbors she knew couldn't explain anything. She said her mother had moved away. She didn't say where. But the small town was thriving. A new shop had opened. People were farming, putting the cattle out to pasture. The hospital was working. There was a poster on the local notice board advertising a holiday home by the river. Inquiries from the inhabitants led nowhere. Camila decided she had to start her life over. It was no coincidence that she received a strange message. A portrait of her granddaughter, changing will earn her forgiveness. Fate would have mercy on her. She decided to start with a temporary move. The flat in the city was on the alarm system. But she didn't have to worry. But she didn't take any things with her. Her old tastes seemed unacceptable for the town. Camila Jones went round the shops, bought suitable outfits for work and everyday life. She spent the rest of the evening tending to the household, going through the kitchen utensils, all in a deplorable state, some chipped, some old, the floors cracked, the wallpaper unchanged for years. Now she realized what a poor state the house was in need of repair. She had not thought about it, having left her mother alone in the village. She only threw in a piece occasionally, sending money a couple of times a year. How did mother live here alone was unfathomable, and a bitter thought befell the neglectful daughter. What if her son had left her so alone? Would life have been easy? Her heart was troubled. How could she do that? No, she deserved everything that happened to her. You can't be selfish, thinking only of yourself. Things are going to be different now, she proclaimed into the void, wiping away her tears. She cleaned the house until evening, made a list of things to buy in the city. I thought I'd go to the local office to find out when my mother had last paid the light bill. It turned out that it was only like 3 months ago. The bills were paid. The landlady herself came to visit. Camila was wary, but the payment was accepted, and in the evening the electricity came on, illuminating the rooms with a cold, dim light. In the morning, Camila left for the city. She drove her car to the village, leaving it at the gate for the night. But after thinking a little, she went to her neighbor's house, sneaked into the house, knocked. It was open. The house was clean, spacious, everything was in order. It seemed that her son had done his best to repair the house, and it stabbed her heart that she herself had never helped anyone. The angry landlady was about to send her away. "Mrs. Kimberly, I'm sorry I've been mean. My bad." What a sly fox. "I won't tell you anything. Just so you know." "You're right, it's too early to forgive. Mother, I must find my son and granddaughter in front of them guilty." "So why did you come to me?" "Go back to your place. Nobody needs you here." "I decided to live here for the summer. I was invited," she muttered quietly, remembering about the letter. "What do you want from me?" "I'm going to town, to the hardware store. I want to make repairs to my mother. I came here to ask if you need anything to buy." "Buy them all. Have you decided?" Mrs. Kimberly grinned slyly. "It's out of the goodness of my heart. What can I do for you?" "Oh, my dear, I can't pretend to be angry for long. Come to me, I was babysitting you while your mother was at work." To her amazement, all Mrs. Kimberly's sternness was gone. She hugged Camila, wiping away her tears. "I'll write you a list, and I have to ask my son. He wanted to go into town too. Maybe he'll come with you." Mrs. Kimberly's son was a little older than she was. As children, they were friends and quarrelsome, annoying each other with mischief. At 15, Michael left his mother, going to school to study electrician, and then returned here to find a job, got married, made an extension to the house. We started a household and lived together. How painful it was for her mother to see it. Her daughter got married and never came back. "Hello, Michael." Camila finally found the right words. "Hi, Meanie." Michael smiled, remembering her past offenses. "I'm going to the city. Your mother has made a list. Maybe you should come with me too? You're not going to kill me?" The irony was uncalled for. When she was a child, she asked to drive his motorbike, but she lost control, drove off a bridge into a river. They were rescued, but the motorbike was banned. Michael didn't forgive her and stopped communicating altogether. He'd do little things, like scare me with caterpillars or drop off mice. "Don't worry, I've been driving for over 20 years. When my husband gave me a car for my wedding, I learned right away." "Did you bury your husband?" "My mother told me. Sorry to remind you." "It's all right. Where's your wife?" "She died. She went out on the ice in the spring. She wanted to rinse the laundry. It got sucked in. She was not saved." Michael said quietly and turned away. "I'm sorry, I didn't know. It was a long time ago. Let's go to town. Wait, I'll change." While Michael was getting ready, a girl with a bag over her shoulder ran up to Camila. "Hi, do you live in this house?" "Yes, I'm here to see my mother." "Here's a letter to this address. Please sign here." "Thank you, girl. Come and visit if you have time." "I've got to go. Goodbye." Camila Jones turned the envelope round. It had her mother's address on it, but it was addressed to Camila. She opened it anxiously, wondering if someone was trying to teach her a lesson or take revenge. On a white sheet of paper in large letters was the single word wormwood. Camila shrieked, dropped the sheet. Jennifer learned that by the evil machinations of her mother-in-law, she could have been left infertile. How could that be? Maybe she peeped on her while she was in the kitchen making her daughter-in-law's herbal tea. "What are you standing there with your mouth open?" Michael asked, approaching. Seeing the leaf, he picked it up, reading the strange message with amazement. "What is this nonsense? Did you get a letter? Your interlocutor is obviously a little verbal." Michael laughed, but quickly stopped. Seeing that, Camila stands in a daze with a lost look. Let's go. The road was silent, not even music on. Michael was dozing in the passenger seat. Then he opened his eyes and blurted, "Your mom came to see us a week ago." "What?" Camila braked sharply, which almost bumped Michael's forehead. "Hey, take it easy. Drop me off. I'd rather walk. You're not very good at driving." "I'm sorry, but why didn't Mrs. Kimberly tell me? I was so worried. Do you know what I've been through? I buried her in my mind." "Don't shout." "What's going on?" Camilla said it quietly and pulled over to the curb. "I don't know. They were whispering in the kitchen without me, and my mother forbade me to talk about it. Don't ask me anything. I'm going to go. We're here." "Wait. I'll find out for myself. Don't say anything. Let's go." The shopping trip took longer than they thought. It was getting dark by the time they'd filled the boot in the back seat. Camila persuaded Michael to spend the night in her flat. He walked round the rooms for a long time with a look of amazement. "It's like a museum. What a place. You must have been crazy to live in the country. The living room alone is as big as your mother's house. Yeah, Mom's living in squalor and her daughter's living in luxury." "Michael, I know what I'm talking about. Come on. Here, you're going to sleep on the couch. Let's go. I'll feed you. Caviar and lobster. I'm coming." "Ugh, you furry hedgehog," she playfully replied with a childhood nickname. Camila thought that it was unbearable to live alone. Caring for others gave her energy. Michael was pensive, looking at his hostess with alienation. The evening was not going well. The guest was obviously hiding something from her, but Camila Jones did not question him, more him. The letters were leading her to some goal, like stages of a test she had to pass. Michael got up in the early morning and got Camila up. He would not leave his mother alone for long. He had to help with the chores. They came back when the neighbor had already put the cow out to graze. "Why didn't you come back yesterday?" "Every hour counts. I can't cope on my own, and it's scary to spend the night alone." She grumbled, then smiled and invited me to tea. We unloaded the shopping. Camila had brought a set of pots and pans as a present for her neighbor. She knew that pots and pans were the trouble with village housewives. Mrs. Kimberly sighed but accepted the gift. The hut was clean, cozy, and warm. The hostess brewed tea, put a wicker with lambs, jam, and honey. The quiet morning in the village was peaceful. Camilla took a sip of tea and looked at the hostess with bewilderment. "Something bitter." "It's bitter for you. Others must have been sweet, remember." "Is it with wormwood?" She choked and coughed up tears. "And you eat it with cloudberry jam. It won't be so bitter," Mrs. Kimberly said with a sly squint. Camila shuddered. Tears ran down her cheeks. She jumped up, ran out without looking at anyone, and ran away. Earlier it was impossible to be pierced by this. Nothing troubled her heart. She did harm to her daughter-in-law with a light hand. But now her conscience, which had been sleeping for many years, awoke and stirred her soul. She sat on the bench at the gate and could not calm down for a long time. There were no more thoughts, only tears flowed unrestrainedly, washing away the blackness that lived in her soul. Granddaughter Caroline was to relieve the bitterness of life. A little while later she went to sort out her things, then fiddled in the kitchen until evening, took everything out to the veranda, painted both the ceiling and the walls, having changed her mind about wallpapering. She just cleaned the floors, and contrary to village tradition, laid a carpet. The old kitchen furniture was falling apart, in need of repair. She persuaded Michael to help, who willingly patched the holes. Camila looked at Michael with admiration. He's a good man. In his 50s and early 50s, he's still a handyman. Michael laughed at the carpet and told her to paint the floors. "Help me set up the furniture. It's up to me to decide what to do. City folk, you're all cuckoo. Oh, for crying out loud. All right, I'll keep the carpet for now, and I'll paint the floors later. You're going to throw that carpet away in 3 days. We'll watch you when you're on the river. I bought a Hoover you've never even heard of." Michael looked at Camila in a friendly way, jokingly pushing her, looking playful. "Oh, Michael, stop pushing me. We have grandchildren to nurse." "God didn't give me grandchildren." He said bitterly, "My son is a border guard. He won't show his nose. It's been 10 years since we've seen each other." "Son? I don't know anything about you. I don't know about anyone. I only cared about myself. After my mother died, he cut off all contact with us. He left like a ghost. He writes letters once a year. He settled down all by himself. He got a flat far away from us, but he didn't have a family. In an outburst of pity, Camila hugged Michael, and he suddenly responded, embraced her and kissed her on the lips. Camila was taken aback. "Have you eaten too much white wine in your old age? You know nothing. And I was in love with you as a child, and you city crazy first attacked me. Me? I don't need any more help from you. I'll see you around." Michael turned and walked away. He muttered to himself, "That's right. You're the one who's trying to teach me a lesson." "My what?" "Wait, spit it out. You can't talk." Michael walked over to Camila, kissed her again, and left quickly. Camila Jones stood in a daze for a minute, then sat down to drink tea in the newly transformed kitchen, the surroundings sparkling clean. Michael had hung the chandelier she'd looked out for in the house, the pendulum clock on the wall, adding to the coziness. Only the old furniture spoilt the overall impression. So the furniture was worth updating. You could order yourself new sofas, a lounge, an armchair, a bed for Mum. How easy were these things to do now? Why hadn't she thought of Mum's comfort before? For a week, Camila made repairs, ordered furniture, while waiting for delivery, painted ceilings and walls. For more than 10 years, she had been sitting on the sofa with soap operas, and now she was working, impressing the neighbors with unprecedented vigor for a mature woman. In the evenings, her back and arms ached, but Camila did not complain. She was patient, glad that God had given her the strength for such an important work. During that week, Michael visited her more than once, helping with the repair of wardrobes, rearranging furniture. Camila got used to him. Communication became warm. More and more often he sat up late, remembered the past, made plans. Michael refused to talk about her mother. At parting, he hugged her like his own, but he did not allow any liberties, kissing her innocently on the cheek. On the 8th day, the renovation was finished. The old kitchen sets were dismantled for firewood. For her mother, she had chosen a color that was not stained, a pleasant shade of gray that gave the kitchen a new glow. With new furniture and fluffy carpets, the house began to play with magical colors. Having put all her energies into renovating the house, Camila exhausted her energy, fell asleep on the new sofa, and woke up to a knock at the door. The postmistress came. The game was dragging on. The relatives sent a parcel. She opened it anxiously. This time there was no message, just 2 jars with some contents. I opened them carefully and tasted. Wormwood and cloudberry are the same thing. It's a vicious circle. I chose the right path a long time ago. I renovated my mother's house. I realized what I'd done to my family. I lost my son. Tell me, haven't I suffered enough? Is it too soon to forgive me? It's too soon. You don't understand. You didn't lock the door, did you? They'll steal my beauty. You scared me. Camila shuddered. The door. What nonsense. What didn't I realize? You have to close the door. That's not what I meant. You just said that. I didn't say anything else. Are you all kidding me? No one. You're the one who did all the renovations. You don't want to talk about it. Go on. Don't make a mess. I just came by to help us with the housework. My mom asked me to. All right, I'll be back in an hour. Michael staggered a bit and went out. Camila cooked breakfast in her head, solving the problem she'd been given. If Jennifer knows of her intrigues, then Camila must go through it too. First to feel the bitterness of life, and then there will be hope in the distance and Hope and Cloudberry, her granddaughter. Camila twirled the jar of wormwood infusion, thought, and drank it down. She choked, drank water, and collapsed. By evening, Michael found Camila lying in the kitchen, sound asleep. There was no way to wake her up. He brought her to the hall, put her on the sofa. She looked charming in her sleep. He decided to stay close to her, to wait for her to wake up, so he locked the door. He walked to the kitchen. His eye caught a jar with some kind of potion on the bottom. He smelled something familiar, remembered the inscription in the letter he'd received recently, wormwood, and thought that Camila's mother had overdone the punishment, but he wouldn't interfere. Let things take their course. They say that Camila herself has been scheming against her daughter-in-law for a year and a half, playing her with her fate and her relationship with her son. He switched off the light and lay down on the bed in the bedroom. Fell asleep quickly, in a sound, farmer's healthy sleep. Camila woke up when it was dark outside the window, surprised that she had no memory of the previous day at all. She opened her eyes and squealed in horror. A dark silhouette stood on her doorstep. She ran to the bedroom, closed the door, sighed, looked at the bed, the scream stuck in her throat. In the semi-darkness, she could see Jennifer sitting with her legs overhung, threatening her with her finger, whispering that she had ruined her unborn children. Jennifer. Jennifer, I'm sorry, for God's sake, it's all my fault, don't hold it against me. An ominous silence was her answer. When Camila looked up in fear, she saw that there was no Jennifer, but a man sleeping on the bed. She jumped up, her temples pounding, her head spinning. She listened, silence, only sniffling. Camila looked out into the living room. No one was there. Switching on the bedroom light, she breathed a sigh of relief. Michael, you scared me. But he was sleeping soundly as a baby, not waking up from his screams. Camila switched off the light and went into the kitchen. There was someone standing at the doorstep. A dark silhouette walked quickly towards Camila. Dazed with horror, she skidded back into the bedroom. But there stood the mother, with an angry expression on her face, moved her whole body, approached, threatened with a finger. Why have you ruined the children, you foolish daughter? She spoiled everyone's life, she herself is in silk. But she didn't think about her mother. Mummy, don't. I'm sorry, don't swear, I'll fix everything. Everything will be different. Her mother had almost reached her and stretched out her hands. Then Michael woke up. He saw Camila, who looked into the void and whispered in madness a plea for forgiveness. Camila, what are you doing? Camila finally saw that there was no one in the room but Michael. His shout made her eyes clearer, but the fear remained.
There's someone in the corridor.
Why did you drink wormwood last night? You can't have visions. Wormwood doesn't give you visions. Something's been spiked, that's what it is. And you can have the second jar. Camila flinched. Jennifer was talking to her. Cloudberries. Eat some cloudberries. Oh my God, it was Jennifer again. My head hurts. It's impossible. Let's go to Mum. She'll tell you what to do. Take the jar. Camila obediently got ready. She could still hear someone else's footsteps in the house. Shadows seemed to lurk in the corners. She fumbled, grabbing Michael by the arm. Has your mother let you go yet?
Just out of sleep, I think.
Mrs. Kimberly took the jar, sniffed and laughed. Well, darling, you'll be dreaming of things for a long time to come. Grebes for grebes, they should have called it. The neighbor laughed again, but sat her guest down. She fiddled with the herbs and poured some fragrant tea. Here, drink it. It'll make you feel better. You probably have a headache. Thank you. I hope it doesn't make me feel better.
If you don't want to drink it, get out of here.
Why are you being so strange, Mrs. Kimberly? You're always pushing me around. Now you're helping me. Camila, remember the basic truth. You can forgive anything, but you can't atone for the guilt of an innocent child. Camila to the house saw Michael, said that today with her babysitting will come in the evening. The woman entered the house anxiously, not noticing anything suspicious. Her head felt heavy, and she wanted to sleep. She fell asleep quickly, barely putting her head on the pillow. She woke up to her family's voice. Hello, daughter. Her mother was sitting on the edge of the sofa. Mum, hello, how I missed you. What a beauty you've made. I wish I'd done it before. It would have been so nice. Mum, I'm sorry, Camila cried, tried to get up but couldn't. She struggled on the sofa, opened her eyes, the cushion was wet. There was no one in the house, it was just a dream. But Mum, we'll meet for real. I'll change everything. My head was still heavy, dizzy, my temples ached. I went to the kitchen, took a jar of jam, twirled it around, tasted it by machine, struggled to do housework. After tidying up, she decided to cook something tasty, make some pies to treat Michael to in the evening. She had a secret sympathy for her neighbor. She felt at ease with him, as if he were her own. After an hour, she was surprised to note that her head was gone and her consciousness was clear. A burst of strength and appetite reminded her that she had quite recovered. Cloudberries helped. For after tea, Mrs. Kimberly had dreams. Camila was starting a new phase of her life, determined to find something to do so she wouldn't sit idle. She used to work under her husband in the prosecutor's office as a secretary. Together with Nicholas's father, they had made a fortune and become respected people in the city. But now Camila realized that no luxury could replace family. The longing for her son, the desire to see her granddaughter and meet her mother became the main value of her life. It was getting dark. Camila cooked some goodies and waited for Michael's arrival, and then, angry, decided to go to bed. There was a knock at the door, but instead of her neighbor, a girl came in and slipped her an envelope and disappeared. This made Camila completely angry. She wanted to throw the letter away, but she relocated herself, sat down and printed out the message. Many roads lead to redemption, but unfortunately not all of them are peaceful. Sounds like a threat. Came a man's voice over the top of her ear. Who's there? Camila shrieked in horror and jumped up sharply. Scaring you is my job. Michael laughed, genuinely laughing at his hostess. Did you do that on purpose? And I baked you pies, you will not get a single one. Get out of here. I'm an old woman. I have nerves, I have a weak heart. If I don't live to see my son and granddaughter, you'll be responsible for this sin. You know that, mark my word. You cursed me. You should close the door. What's the fashion? She came like a witch. I'll go to bed, mad woman. Wait, sit down, eat. Woof. What are you doing? You're giving me commands like a dog. I'm sorry, I was only joking. Bring me your pies. Okay, but don't sneak around again. Next time I'll give my soul to God for sure. Don't be pompous, you've got another 30 years on you. What kind of treatment is that? Don't you have any other words for me? There are, but you'll like them even less. Don't say anything. I can't imagine what's going on in your head. You, Michael said with a sudden change of tone, and then added with a smirk, you, my love, are a pain in the arse. Camila Jones choked on her tea, coughed up tears, wanted to answer something, but instead sat silently, her eyes goggling. Have you lost your mind, you furry hedgehog? The suitor did not expect such a reaction. He wanted mutual recognition, warmth of relations, that she would lower her eyes modestly, take her hand and say that she needed him very much. Indignantly, he jumped up, ran outside, and Camila slumped into her chair. She herself had not expected such a reaction from herself. She was considered a reserved lady. Why did she have the country ways of a silly girl? After cleaning up the kitchen and closing the doors, she lay down. She woke up early, remembered last night with shame, and then fulfilled the promise she had made to herself. Before lunch, she went round the village looking for work. Everywhere they offered only temporary help in the household. Then she resolutely went home and changed her clothes. Redemption, that's what was needed. That's what the letter said. First, she went to Mrs. Kimberly's house to help with the vegetable garden. Then she went round the neighbors to make life easier for the old people. She didn't take any money for her work, and she refused to buy groceries. It was getting dark by the time she got home. Her back was sore from unaccustomedness, but she felt happy. For the first time in many days, she felt proud. As she approached the porch, she heard a rustling behind the house, a dark figure, a vision. She decided to see what was there, but after walking a few steps, she suddenly fell into a hole, hit her head on something hard, and lost consciousness. When I woke up, it was unclear what time of day it was, but it was dark all around. She turned her head and tried to get up, bumped herself, shrieked, felt around. There were wooden walls everywhere, boards on top. She was trapped in some kind of box. A cold, sickening sense of dread filled her. The hopelessness of it scared her deathly. Help me. Help me. Help. Camila screamed and thrashed hysterically. It seemed to her that an infinite amount of time had passed. Her body felt stiff, her head ached, but she took a full breath and calmed down. She remembered the words from the letter, not all roads to redemption are peaceful. It was too much, too much. You can't torture a person like that, you can't. Camila screamed and cried as she climbed to the top. Then she noticed that the lid was sliding. She pressed her hands and head against it, opened it with effort, was blinded by daylight, squeezed her eyes shut, then stood up. Her heart hammered and nearly stopped with terror. She was standing in a grave, in a coffin. It was a cemetery. From the last strength on weakening legs, she began to get out of the grave. At that time, the drunken watchman came running to her screams. When he saw someone climbing out of the grave, he almost had a stroke, but he ran up and managed to push Camila out of the grave. Ugh, damned zombie, sit with your ugly face, where your relatives put you. Despair seized the unhappy woman, but she guessed to talk calmly. Granddaddy and Granddaddy, be careful. She called out to the watchman. Oh, it's the evil one. Lord, forgive me. I've sinned. I repent. I swear I'll never drink again. Grandfather, I'm alive. I fell down. I was visiting my family, and here is an open grave. Grandfather, please help me, pitifully pleaded Camilla. A cunning zombie, pretending to be a human. He looked into the grave, saw Camila there, in her black work clothes, with her tangled hair loose. Help me, you idiot, you stupid bloody fool. Get me out of here at once. She whispered in helplessness, as if hissing at her grandfather. Holy Mother of God, what a disgrace. The watchman ran away frightened, not stopping to cross himself. Well, and go, you heartless man, go yourself. On the third attempt, Camila got out. The cemetery was deserted. Beyond it, a field, a path led somewhere, but where the village was, it was difficult to understand.
The roads to redemption are far from peaceful.
How did I even get here? How could anyone do this to a living person? I sat down by the roadside, braiding my hair, which seemed deliberately unraveled and tangled. In the ominous silence of the cemetery, thoughts of life and death came to mind. This is the end of everyone's life. How much in us is empty, unnecessary, contrived? The end of one in the grave, damp earth. As long as you're alive, you should not only think about yourself. I wasn't crying, it's just dumbness. There's a path ahead. Does it lead to a new life? I have to go through it. Maybe this is the road that's not peaceful. Mummy, tell me, are you playing games with me? How could you do such a thing? Camila knew the answer. She had forgotten the way to her mother. It was time to go back. That's where the soul would be born again. She mentally forgave for everything. This redemption was important. She would overcome any difficulties and beg for forgiveness. The path led to the road. Only no one passed by. In about 15 minutes, Camila was exhausted. She was thirsty and her legs ached. She sat down on the side of the road and decided to wait for a car. A tractor appeared, and by some fateful coincidence, Kevin was behind the wheel, and he agreed to give her a lift to the village for a small fee. Camila breathed a sigh of relief, then noticed a familiar rucksack at her feet, leaned over and twirled it, horrified to see the secret embroidery on the strap, which she herself had customized for her son, Nick Johnson. Stop this right now. Tell me where you got that from. I found this rucksack on the side of the road. It was a long time ago. I don't remember when. Tell me the truth. Camila went after the driver, slapped him. Kevin didn't stand for it, got out and threw the woman out of the tractor and drove off. Camila Jones made her way to the village in tears. She was determined to find out for sure. There was a glimmer of hope of finding her son. His rucksack is here, so Nicholas has arrived. He and Jennifer are not far away. They're making fun of her. When she reached home, she locked herself in the dark and fell into a heavy sleep. Michael came to her more than once, but could not get through. Camila woke up for the first time late in the afternoon, heated water, washed herself properly, and ate with appetite. Life was coming back to her. The apathy of the last few days had subsided. She got dressed up and took her documents, deciding to go to the neighborhood policeman. Hello, 5 years ago my son went to this small town but never returned. Wait, said the officer on duty. I'll call a neighborhood policeman to you, and you'll make a statement with him. The woman waited for an hour. Then she was invited into the office. Hello, Richard Gray, the district police officer. What do you want to see us about? Camila Jones gave a detailed account of the events of the last 5 years. She described yesterday's incident in detail. She was asked to write a statement, promising to sort out the rucksack. Called in the evening, told to report to the station, refused to search. Kevin Reed showed a brand new rucksack with no embroidery. The house was searched. Nothing was found. A clever bloke figured out what was going on, got rid of the stuff, burnt it in the backyard. Camila did not achieve anything. The trail was broken, but she did not take the statement. The policeman angrily escorted the woman out, stiffly telling her that Nicholas was missing. Camila did not give up. She decided to turn to Michael for help. She needed to nail this Kevin guy to the wall, but the neighbor refused to help. Are you crazy, going to an ex-prisoner with a war? Just take it easy. It'll work itself out. Don't you realize that's my son's rucksack? I haven't seen him in 5 years, and this Kevin Reed guy is obviously making trouble. If you don't help me, I'll go to him myself. No, you can't stop, and anyway, where the hell were you yesterday? Helping out in the garden for free again. Yeah, I was helping out, digging in the ground. She didn't want to say anything so she wouldn't scare Michael. Let's face it, I don't need it. It keeps my mind off my dark thoughts. They stood on the doorstep, arms around each other, as if they were young, with all the burdens off their shoulders. People who had passed the test, forgiven each other for the present and the past. Mrs. Kimberly was calm, but only told him to help with the household chores as before. The new message arrived 2 days after the cemetery. Camila was already expecting it and opened it without excitement. It was a postcard with an invitation to visit the holiday home by the river. Michael took the news calmly. Mrs. Kimberly sighed mysteriously, smiled imperceptibly. They both knew the landlady of this inn. Camila had one last test ahead of her. Michael refused to go with her no matter how much she begged him. He remained adamant. Camila hastily packed, took the invitation card and set off on her journey. The journey was not long, about an hour. The good road changed to a road without tarmac, and it became more difficult to drive. Every now and then the car bounced. Finally, a holiday home appeared in the distance, occupying an impressive space. Several hunting lodges and a 2-story building were located along the river. At the gate, the guard let her through without question. Driving into the territory, she read the name. In bright red letters on the building was written Cloudberry. 5 years ago, Jennifer Jones had found herself on the street because of her mother-in-law's dastardly scheming. The biggest blow was her husband's betrayal. Did not believe, did not support, kicked out as a mean woman. She could not bear it. Her heart was broken. There was no point in living any further. Without a shadow of a doubt, she stepped on the road, but a man who was passing nearby, a second before the irreparable, pushed Jennifer away. She only hit her head, but still went to the hospital. The doctor told the unbelievable news. The girl was pregnant. Only this saved Jennifer from the monstrous pain on her heart. She wiped her tears and decided to live against fate. She did not want to return to her husband. She could not forgive the betrayal. There was only one way back to her homeland, to her native small town. When Jennifer returned, she tidied up the house and cried for 5 days after being locked up. It was worth it to get her life together for the sake of her child. After relocating herself, she drove into town and quit her job at the shop. Camila's mother, Nicholas's grandmother, the same Mrs. Cassandra, met Jennifer at the shop and told her to tell her the truth. They were not only neighbors. Jennifer often helped with the household. Nicholas's grandmother came to visit. The girl became a native for a lonely woman, but Camila did not know it and did not see beyond her nose. In the evening, the pregnant Jennifer could not resist and told Mrs. Cassandra at length what she had been through in the past year and a half. The neighbor wept, unable to believe the meanness of her own daughter. Then the old woman took Jennifer in to help her through this difficult time. The girl got a job in a bakery and managed to help her patroness as well. When Camila came in search of traces of Nicholas and Jennifer, the daughter-in-law was in the next room. She also bribed the people of her town to make her mother-in-law think Jennifer had not returned to the village. Not for a second did the daughter-in-law feel sorry for her mother-in-law, but the news about Nicholas disturbed her. She began her search. The first attempts to find her husband were in vain. 7 months later, Jennifer gave birth to a daughter and named her Caroline. One day, walking on the riverbank, the girl thought how good it is in a small town. From the big city you can rest. After all, it is a very good idea to build a house on the shore, so that in it the inhabitants of the big city could have a rest. This thought she shared with Mrs. Cassandra. To her great surprise, she brought the whole 2 million wrapped in a cloth. Wow, where did you get that kind of wealth? I've been saving, Camila's been throwing money at me like a dog and I can't spend it. She wouldn't show her face to me for 5 years. Only Nicholas used to come round and leave me some money too. I saved up. I wanted to give it to a good cause or a church. I don't need anything myself. Take it. I'm sorry to you. You've suffered because of my daughter. Thank you. It's not just for me. It's for you and a good cause. After consulting a lawyer from the city, Jennifer got a permit and bought a plot of land by the river. The first house came out small. At first, Jennifer didn't think it would be anything worthwhile. She advertised in the city. People showed up. buying places 2 months in advance. A year later, 2 two-story buildings were built, supplemented with hunting lodges. The demand did not fall, and the profit grew. For the summer, Jennifer and her grandmother moved into a cabin built especially for them. All the while, the girl continued her search. She knew that Nicholas never returned home. From work, he was expelled because of a long absence. Jennifer traveled all over the county in search of her husband. Once she remembered the godforsaken farm, Nicholas, who lived under the name Norman, remembered the past in scraps. Once he had easily settled a dispute between men by reciting lines of law that popped up. After that, people began to go to him for minor matters, to secure their property by law, or to register land, to fill out documents. It became clear, not just a guest was sheltered. Over time, Nicholas cooled to his common-law wife. An unknown anxiety was troubling his soul. He went to the river all day fishing, wistfully recalled the same village, his grandmother. Pictures of the past life gradually returned to him. Catherine immediately realized that Norman began to avoid her. The stern girl packed her things and returned to her mother. Nicholas Jones has not thought to return that one. Only suffering he brought his indifference. There, in the depths of memories, woke up feeling for the mysterious girl with a basket of cloudberries. He saw her in a dream, walking along the road. Then everything was cut off by a black cloth. So he suffered for another 6 months, remembering the past in fragments. He found out where he was found, and the next day, without informing anyone of his plans, was going to go to his native small town. In the morning, he got up early, got on his motorbike, and drove away. It had been almost 2 years since he had crashed before reaching his destination. Now he knew for sure that this journey had to be completed. That same day, Jennifer arrived at the farm where Nicholas lived. She went round 5 yards before they dared to tell her the truth about the accident. Jennifer was taken to Nicholas's house, but no one was there. The villagers threw up their hands and invited her to visit. She could finally tell who they had sheltered, they in their village. Nicholas pulled onto the road, read the signs, looked around, then stopped his gaze on the cars that occasionally passed by. He remembered, instantly refreshed, the memory of that fateful day when a tractor had driven at him on this very spot. Jennifer, a sharp pain stabbed at his heart. How will you be without me? He guessed that all the misfortunes had befallen them, only because of his own mother. One planted packet of pills and a fictitious note had ruined an entire family's life. Nicholas took a long time to come to his senses, hesitant to continue on his way. He walked between the trees, horrified by the abyss in which he had lived for the last 2 years, as if he had come out of a coma. Finally, he decided to go to his grandmother to comfort her. It seemed to him that an eternity had passed. When he reached his grandmother's doorstep, he ran into the veranda. Towards him, hearing the motorcycle, ran out Mrs. Cassandroy. Both were crying and laughing. "Nicholas, you're alive," I felt, "my darling. That you were coming back, that you were alive. Let me look at you. You've grown up. Grandma, you're still the same. Don't cry. It's all right. Everything will be different now. How could you torture us like that for 2 years? Didn't your heart tell you? Didn't you feel sorry for your family? I just remembered you today, Grandma. Where's Jennifer? She went to look for you. You don't know anything, Father." She gave me a sly grin and led me into the house. "Caroline, come and meet your father." Nicholas saw a little girl looking with clear blue eyes. "Daughter." He exhaled and burst into bitter tears again. Kicked out his pregnant wife. For 2 years she was alone without him. The girl shook her uncle's hand and ran off to play. She was brought up by her mother and grandmother. She was too young to understand the complexities of life. "Where's Jennifer?" "Jennifer went looking for you?" "She's been looking all the time. She went to the farm." Nicholas shuddered as he missed his wife. That fate was confusing them. He decided to wait here for her return and had a long talk with his grandmother. Mrs. Cassandra bitterly told him that not only Jennifer but also his other girls had been turned away from her son by his mother. Camila once even repented in a fit of despair about how she had separated her son from Jennifer, how she had written a letter to her son on his behalf, how she had wanted to make him infertile. Nicholas could hardly believe that his mother had arranged the meanness. A lump came to his throat. In vain he didn't believe his wife, defended his mother. Because of her he had almost lost his life, his wife and his daughter. "Grandma, you can't let it go." I don't want to see or know her again. Jennifer returned late at night, approaching the house, saw Nicholas's motorbike, dazed, burst into tears and rushed into the house with all her might. Bursting in, she threw herself around Nicholas's neck because she knew her lover had not betrayed her. Caroline ran to her mother and started beating Nicholas with her palms, afraid that her uncle would hurt her mother. They decided to all live together, but moved into a holiday home, which needed owner supervision. Mrs. Cassandra stayed on, promising to move in with her grandson and great-granddaughter later. The holiday home prospered, growing. Nicholas's help proved invaluable. They correctly registered the property, expanded, wisely conducted business. Nicholas called his daughter Cloudberry and spent all his free time with her. The girl did not dote on her father, attached to him with all his heart. For 3 more years, Nicholas did not want to hear anything about his mother. Time has softened him a little, and he decided to forgive his mother. But only by changing would she be forgiven. Nicholas himself devised a plan of redemption. Jennifer and grandmother accepted the proposal to teach her mother a lesson, not immediately. It seemed too cruel a way to bring Camila to her senses. Come on, Nicholas, Mom's been through enough. 5 years since she lost you. Jennifer, she didn't even spare our future children. Nicholas, I never drank her teas. It was impossible to drink that stuff. Sometimes she switched the decoction, sometimes she poured it out. It was disgusting. What did she use for wormwood? Let her drink the wormwood herself. It was like this. Nicholas had been living at the house of Mrs. Kimberly, a neighbor. When Camila came to the house, the son was in the back room, a few meters away from his mother. He was glad to have her around, alive and well, but changing her character was more important than meeting her. For the time being, Mrs. Cassandra had moved into Jones's house at the holiday base. Nicholas wrote a message, changing his handwriting beyond recognition. He wanted his mother herself to feel a little of what Jennifer had experienced. It didn't seem enough for him to just confuse her. He invented a whole epic of redemption, remorse, separation from his granddaughter, the bitterness of loneliness. The cloudberries and wormwood were also prepared by Mrs. Kimberly, and the wormwood was laced with sleeping pills and hallucinogenic grapes. It seemed unnecessary, superfluous, but Nicholas persuaded his neighbor, as it could do no harm. At the pharmacy, they took a remedy for poisoning, which they mixed into the cloudberries. Nicholas came in the night when his mother drank a decoction of wormwood, worried how she felt. But it turned out that the son only aggravated the situation, scaring the mother to death. The story of the repairs and help stunned Nicholas. It was beyond his plans, but it was a good sign. Camila changed beyond recognition, began dating Michael. The neighbor was against this punishment, but he could not change anyone's mind. He only supported Camila in her troubles. The hardest step for the son was the story of the cemetery, but once he himself cheated death, as if born again, he looked at everything with different eyes. He wanted to make his mother feel the same way. The hole was not deep, but he forgot to put the shovel away. Camila hit her head, but not badly. Nicholas gave her a shot with sleeping pills and took her to a pre-prepared hole in the cemetery. There was indeed a man to be buried there, so the grave was dug. He hastily chipped something that looked like a coffin, more like a box with a lid easily removable from the inside. He had even carefully placed a pillow. Later, Nicholas was horrified at what he had done, but remembering that Jennifer had lived in hell for 1.5 years and then almost lost a child, he calmed his conscience. He waited anxiously for his mother's return. He knew that the local people would pick her up on the road. The lust for life would take its toll. Camila returned in a deplorable state, and then went to the police station. But Richard Gray knew Nicholas's story, and even befriended him, sometimes using his legal knowledge. He rang Camila's son beforehand and asked what to do. That way Camila didn't find out ahead of time that Nicholas was alive. Perhaps the son's decision to leave his mother in the dark was too cruel. For 3 years he held a grudge. He couldn't forgive. Only Jennifer, P, and Grandma softened his heart. They sympathized with Camila with all their souls, several times wanted to tell her that Nicholas was alive, but did not dare to interfere. The long-awaited moment had come. Camila Jones arrived at their holiday home and entered the main building. There was no one in the lobby. An Indian tune was playing. She looked around, saw the television, and was taken aback. Pictures of her granddaughter, mother, daughter-in-law, and son were changing one after another. Nicholas, she whispered quietly, tearfully. "I'm sorry, Mum." A familiar voice sounded behind her. Camila turned round, saw Nicholas, shrieked and fell senseless. She had to call an ambulance. Later it got worse. They took her to the city clinic. The woman had suffered a stroke. Nicholas could not believe what was happening. Instead of a happy reunion and family reunion, he drove his mother to the hospital. Silenced, Mrs. Cassandra, without a word, packed up, left for her home. The magical transformation of the dwelling echoed painfully in her heart. Her daughter had lovingly furnished it. She had made a miracle with her own hands. The old mother sat on the new sofa, thinking that not so long ago Camila had slept here. "I forgive you, my daughter," she said tearfully. She lay down on the sofa and fell asleep and never woke up again. In the evening, Mrs. Cassandra was visited by Michael as usual, but it was too late. He broke the sad news to the Johnsons. 3 days later, the funeral took place. Half the town gathered to say goodbye. Nicholas and Jennifer cried uncontrollably. Cloudberry screamed loudly, unable to understand why her beloved grandmother had been buried in the ground. Camila was discharged a week later. Still recovering from the blow, she tried to speak, but nothing came out. She could hardly move, mumbled and cried. For the first time, the family lived at Mrs. Cassandra's house. Nicholas nursed his mother, gave her massages, made her do exercises, and in the evenings got on his motorbike and went somewhere. He couldn't forgive himself for the anger he harbored towards his mother. Whatever she was still his own. He himself is just as bad a person. He himself must go on a journey of redemption. His mother's illness, his grandmother's death, and the weight of guilt heaped on his shoulders. Michael came to Camila, took her in his arms, put her in the pram he had bought for her, and they walked together along the river. After 2 months, Camila began to speak and walk on her own. "Michael, I want to go home."
Where to?
"To the city." "And your son, your granddaughter? Are you coming with me?" "How can I leave my mum?" "You'll visit her. We'll get her a helper." Michael was really attached to Camille. After some thought, he agreed. The next day, while Nicholas and Jennifer were at work, they left for the city. Nicholas was informed of the move by Mrs. Kimberly, shook her head sternly, and from then on stopped all communication with him. 10 years passed. The young, beautiful Cloudberry, who was now called Caroline, graduated from high school and entered teacher training college. Over time, Camila thawed out, recovered. In the city, she took rehabilitation courses at the best clinic. For the summer, she and Michael moved to the countryside, visiting Nicholas. Mrs. Kimberly lived in the city for 5 years next to her son. She passed away quietly, with God's blessing, buried next to Mrs. Cassandra. They were neighbors as well as they ever were. The family council decided that Caroline would now live in town like a queen. They entrusted her with the ancestral flat. Michael and Camila sold the house in the village, gathered their savings, and went traveling. There were too many painful memories here. The Johnsons Jr. sold Mrs. Cassandra's house, deciding to leave the small town. They bought a condo in Florida, hired a manager for their holiday home base, and moved in. They visited their daughter almost every month, until she graduated and got a job in their small town as a primary school teacher. Camila and Michael come to visit to see their granddaughter. They traveled all over the United States and then went to live by the sea. Over time, the holiday home passed to Caroline, who remains faithful to the land where she was born. Every summer she comes to the cemetery with a basket of cloudberries to visit her grandmother. Pitiful technician's daughter. You'll never get out of the mud, laughed her classmates. And 15 years later, Carolina sat at the railway station on her day off and looked hopefully at the people passing by her. On a small table in front of the girl were laid out a variety of papier-mâché figures, very skillful, and hand-colored with acrylic paints, small animals, birds, scenes from children's fairy tales. All this regularly attracted the attention of potential buyers. Except that, having learnt the price, they immediately turned away sullenly with the words, "Why is it so expensive? My Thomas can make such nonsense in a couple of minutes, and paint it even faster. What's all this money for?" Caroline only pressed her lips together in embarrassment. She was asking for nothing. But the inhabitants of their provincial town, who were used to saving money on almost everything, did not want to pay for the labor of her invalid father, even if she was also thrown into the mud every time what kind of an exclusive you have that you ask so much. Caroline tried to sell figurines at the railway station in the hope that some of the capital's tourists would be able to appreciate these creations. But she was quickly kicked out. She was told to pay a percentage or get out. Carolina wouldn't have minded paying for her workplace, but the amount the racketeers told her was a mockery $10,000 a day. Where am I going to get that kind of money? She asked the big man in the tracksuit, who was not shy of smoking a stinking cigarette in front of her. In a month, God willing, I'll be able to earn at least half of that. The burly man exhaled the acrid smoke into the girl's face with relish, then smiled wryly. Well, it's what you wanted, baby. This is big business, by the way. If you want, you can always pay for the place in kind. The man gave the girl a steely stare that made Caroline want to wash herself at once. Don't, she muttered grimly, lowering her gaze. I'll pack everything up and go now, then. The bully hummed disappointedly. Caroline shook her head negatively. Like, we could make a deal. The creep held out his big tobacco-smelling hand to Caroline. However, the girl staggered sharply to the side, warningly. I'm going to scream or call the police for help. Just try to touch me. The jock lowered his hand, and for a second it hovered in the air a centimeter from her face. Then he grinned and said playfully, "And you're not stupid at all, and you're beautiful. You shouldn't want to join our company. You should buy yourself some clothes. You walk around like a bum in your last rags." I don't mess with bandits, the girl answered him in a serious tone and began to put her rustic luggage into a small sports bag given to her by her father. She was about to leave the platform when the bandit suddenly blocked her way with his massive torso. He looked down at her like she was a bug and smiled nastily at her. "Let me through," the girl mumbled without looking at him. The boogeyman in reply bent closer to her and in a low voice said threateningly, "You think properly, Caroline," he exhaled along with another puff of smoke her name. "You'd be better off with me, and it's in your best interest. You're almost out of high school. Where do you go from here? Do you know the connections I have in this town? If I say the word, no one will hire you. Not even as a cleaner. So you won't be able to continue your mum's career. I'll take care of that." "There's already someone to take care of me," replied the girl, boldly looking the scoundrel in the eye. "I said I won't come here again, let me pass. Or I'll really call the police now." "Is this about your daddy, or what?" The man grinned and gave a bullhorn with the toe of his trainers. "He won't help you, if anything. And the police here think they all work for me." The thug looked around and added briefly, "Anyway, I've told you everything. Don't you say anything to him, and don't you pawn me off." Carolina, who turned 17 earlier this year, did look a little older than her age trim thanks to daily jogging and her technician mother's help cleaning the shops. And at the same time, slim as a graceful rose, she was admired by almost all the boys at school. However, because of the low social status of her family, no one, except for such criminals as this big guy was he himself looked no more than 20, did not consider the girl as a love interest. Caroline herself never looked for romantic adventures and devoted all her free time exclusively to helping her parents. But even if this scoundrel had suddenly turned out to be the last man on earth, she would never have agreed to be his date. The girl saw a couple of times, as near the only nightclub in their town, gangsters like him left in the arms of young, disappointed, dressed in short skirts. Caroline didn't have to guess who they were. She was old enough to realize how complicated real life was. But even in her worst dream, the girl couldn't imagine such a shameful future awaiting her. "I'll give you a sweet life in this little town. Don't doubt it," said the scoundrel. Standing before this unpleasant force, Caroline began to feel herself slowly but surely overcome by fear. After all, she was all alone in the station, and there was no one to protect her. Fortunately, at that moment, the villain's mobile phone rang, and Caroline, taking advantage of the fact that he was distracted, hurriedly slipped out of the bandit's sight. She returned home that day depressed and penniless. It was the last Sunday in May, which meant that she had the longest and most horrible week before graduation ahead of her. All her classmates would only talk about who and what dress to wear, and what hairstyle and manicure to choose for this important holiday. And guys will try as soon as possible to invite the prettiest girls of the school to the ball. And only Caroline, of course. No one will be invited to spend time at the last school party in her life. Nor will she have any dress, shoes, or manicure. "Honey, are you okay, Jennifer?" the girl's mother inquired cautiously. "You're all pale today. Didn't manage to sell anything at all." Caroline covered her eyes with her hands, unable to hold back the tears that were about to spill. "My girl, what's wrong? Has someone hurt you?" the woman asked again, clasping her crying daughter to her side. "I don't want to go to this stupid prom," Caroline finally managed to utter, trying to control her sobs. Jennifer stroked her daughter's soft, dark blonde, shiny hair and looked into her lovely golden brown eyes. "Honey, but prom is one of the most important days in any girl's life, isn't it? Are you sure you want to miss such an important event? There won't be a second time like this in your life," her mother warned her. Caroline only sobbed a couple of times, then sat down on the bed and began to wipe her eyes thoroughly with a handkerchief. "And it's a good thing it won't," she said. "What haven't I seen at this feast of female vanity? The guests will all do nothing but show off their expensive dresses to each other and drink cheap red wine, while the class teacher and the principal discuss the biggest gossip of the year in a corner of the gym." Jennifer smiled at her daughter, but Caroline saw a slight sadness in that smile. "Are you really that worried about not having anything to wear?" she asked affectionately. "I've already put some money aside for you for a dress. And the shoes, you can have my shoes. Do you remember the loafers like that? I married your father in them." Her mother's eyes clouded with unpleasant memories. Sometimes Caroline marveled at how much her parents loved each other, even though they had lived together for many years and endured hardships. Jennifer had come to this town from a remote village where she had been raised by her grandmother until she came of age. Unfortunately, Jennifer was never able to enroll in any educational institution to continue her studies. The knowledge she received in the village was barely enough to keep her from starving. The young girl was offered only low-skilled work as a cleaner, or, even worse, openly obscene offers. In order to get a foothold in this place and make ends meet, Caroline's mother got a job as a floor cleaner in the office of a taxi company near the station. It was there that she met Michael, her future husband. Michael had been working as a taxi driver for several years and was earning quite well. He was immediately attracted to a modest, pretty cleaner who came to their town from the province. Her purity and openness touched the heart of the man, so that soon the taxi driver invited the girl to the first date, after which he and Jennifer began to officially meet. About a year later, the couple planned a wedding, after which the young people happily lived in marriage for almost 10 years. During this time, they had Caroline, a charming daughter, the name Jennifer gave because of her great love for the flower of the same name. All this time, the woman continued to work in a taxi park, and her husband to drive the residents to the suburbs. The salary received by Jennifer was not large, but thanks to Michael, their small family steadfastly kept afloat, being able, though not lavish, but to buy everything necessary for life. The year that little Caroline turned 11, however, disaster came knocking. Michael was driving an elderly couple from the village back to the city. The weather that autumn was very wet, and it was raining constantly. Because of this, the driver had to be doubly attentive on the wet road, making sure that he could fit into the next corner or brake in time at the traffic lights. The elderly people Michael was driving, as it turned out, were very unrestrained and overly emotional. The elderly people Michael was driving were, as luck would have it, very unrestrained and overly emotional. They were constantly dissatisfied with something and threatened to write a complaint against the taxi driver. Because of this, Caroline's father now and then distracted from the road, trying to pacify the nagging couple. At one of these sensitive moments, the man missed a warning sign and, unable to control himself, smashed through an iron fence, sending him and his passengers into a ditch. The car flipped several times on the steep slope before stopping its fateful course. As luck would have it, the elderly couple were virtually unhurt, with only a few scratches, while Michael's life hung in the balance. His right arm was damaged so badly that the man risked dying at any moment due to heavy blood loss. Doctors miraculously managed to save his life, but the mutilated arm, alas, had to be amputated. When the taxi driver regained consciousness, he could not believe what had happened for a long time. How could it be? He was the breadwinner of the family. What would happen to his wife and daughter? Jennifer managed with great difficulty to calm him down and assure him that life goes on. No matter what happened, they would always be together. And she would do whatever was necessary to get them through these hard times. Since then, Caroline's mother has had to work 3 times as hard, taking extra shifts at the city hospital as well as at her daughter's school. Although Michael fell into a brief apathy at first, soon enough he was able to pull himself together. After all, with one arm or two, he continued to be the head of the family and could not allow himself to be completely supported by his wife and daughter. Caroline was by then already actively helping her mother. The man began to develop his left arm and look for ways to earn an alternative income. Naturally, working in a taxi was out of the question. After another 6 months, he mastered the art of creating papier-mâché figurines and weaving baskets from vines, for which he traveled to the nearest forest, where he collected suitable wood. Persistent and strong-minded, Michael was ready to sell the fruits of his labor himself. But to this occupation, all the local men who personally knew Caroline's father treated not so much with contempt, but rather with a slight sneer. They said that he had been a normal man, driving people around, and now he had stooped to selling baskets in the street. Then Caroline offered her father to sit instead of him on a busy shopping street of the town with his daughter. "Is it enough for you to walk the corridors to class with your mother?" she asked. The father refused at first out of pride. "It's not good enough for you. I understand how your classmates look at you because of that," he said. Caroline was embarrassed, but tried to brush it off. "To hell with them," the girl answered him, smiling. "I'm not doing this to amuse them, but because we need the money. You spend a lot of time on this weaving and figurines, and women are much more willing to buy such things. What about your studies?" Her father looked at her doubtfully. "What about my studies? Studying won't run away," Caroline answered him simply. "I will trade at weekends, and first I will try the squares. Or the markets, then I'll go to the railway station. A lot of people pass by there during the day. Maybe we'll make some money." Michael furtively brushed a large tear from the corner of his eye. He thanked God every day for giving him such a beautiful, understanding, and supportive family. He could hardly have dreamed of anything more in his life. Except that it was a little hard without a hand. "All right," he agreed. "But only after work, straight home. I don't want you to fall behind in your classes because of this." "Don't worry," laughed back her daughter. "I learn new material quickly. As my teachers tell me, everything will be fine." Caroline shook her father's hand encouragingly and thought about how much she loved her family. For the sake of these people, she was ready to endure any difficulties, as long as they were healthy, fed, and had the opportunity to meet each new day with joy. Michael not unreasonably worried about the attitude of classmates to his daughter. No matter how friendly Caroline tried to behave with them, the school community flatly refused to accept her. Although the girl turned out to be the most attractive, not at all awkward in the class, and regularly received only excellent grades in physical education, other, more successful classmates only did that sought to tease Caroline at every opportunity. "What, Carolina, are you preparing for your after-school program again?" Vanessa, the first beauty of the class, mocked her in the locker room. "Let me guess, do you have an extra class today to carry buckets of water or not?" "Oh wait, must be obstacle course practice. You're jumping up and down the stairs with a mop?" Vanessa was laughing a hysterical, unpleasant laugh. Caroline had to restrain herself from saying something equally caustic and unflattering. The girl tried to avoid school fights, but it did not mean that she was ready to tolerate such an attitude to herself until the end of her senior year. "Vanessa, you'd better finish taking your weight loss supplements," she said calmly, tying her old trainers. The classmates' laughter broke off abruptly. "I'm serious. It's already melted your brains. You're laughing like a lunatic." Vanessa's face instantly contorted into a grimace of anger and disgust. Caroline realized she'd guessed right. Vanessa had been frantically trying to lose weight for the past few months to fit into the designer dress her parents had promised her for the prom. The only problem was that the size range of such outfits ended exclusively at size 42. "You little brat, you filthy little brat. You'll never get married with such a horrible pedigree. So you're wasting your time training and running 5 kilometers a day." The girl was ready to run even 10 kilometers. She spat out in anger. "The most you can be in this town is an elite call girl. And that's if you don't despise sleeping with a girl who's been mudding like a pig since high school. Vanessa threw with all her might at Caroline a dirty rag that the cleaning lady had left in the locker room so she wouldn't have to go far to get a change of clothes. The piece of cloth fell on Carolina's head with a loud smack, and all the girls in the room burst out laughing. Serves her right, you upstart. Show her where she belongs, will you? Vanessa was taunted by her friends. You think you can open your filthy mouth here? Caroline was shaking like a fever. She had never felt such hatred from others. More than anything else in the world, she wanted to disappear, to dissolve like vapor from water on a hot surface. She didn't realize how she had shouted in her heart to all those puffed-up puppets. Choke on your anger. All you know is to wash the bones of blokes, don't you? You have no interests in each other's lives except money and rags. I hate you all, you puffed-up pussies. Caroline didn't realize how she had jumped out of the changing room. The girl rushed past all the other students and ran down the corridor right into the street. Once she was in the school stadium, she heard a chant. Caroline. Class hadn't started yet. Where are you going? Harry, the gym teacher, shouted after her. But the girl didn't listen to him. She ran 5 laps in a row before her heart was able to beat again. Caroline didn't know where she got her ability to run, but she was sure that everything in life is given to a person for a reason. And if she had the opportunity to develop this ability, then she should use it, especially since running was the only thing that helped her calm down and bring her chaotic thoughts into relative order. Trying to regain her breath, Caroline approached her classroom. The boys, lined up in a row and unaware of what had recently happened in the girls' locker room, looked at their classmate with surprise, and some with outright envy. Watch and learn. The gym teacher waved his hand in Carolina's direction. 3 kilometers in 10 minutes. And your shoes are ready to be included in the Olympic team. Not like you idiots. To the left, go, 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 go. There was a loud whistle, and Carolina's classmates, with dejected faces, ran their standard 6 laps. Well done, Caroline. Harry patted her on the shoulder. Take a rest, bye. It's the first time I've seen results like yours in 5 years. A real talent. The gym teacher shook his head and went off to follow the older students, while Caroline sat on the sports bench and pondered his words. Sure, it was a little late for her to start a sports career, but could her running talents be applied in a more productive way? The answer to this question the girl has not yet found for herself, precisely because of the incident in the locker room, and also because of a series of regular petty bullying from other girls. Caroline did not want to go to the prom. However, Jennifer still managed to persuade her daughter not to miss such a momentous event. After all, it's better to take your diploma from them right away, so that you don't have to go there again, the understanding mother winked. But you must never show them that you are scared. And if you don't come to the graduation, that's exactly what you'll show them. Let's not give them something to gossip about. Okay, Caroline sighed heavily, but agreed. Okay, let this be my last fight. Jennifer helped to choose and buy for her daughter the most beautiful dress they could find in an inexpensive second-hand shop, a simple cut, but at the same time very elegant and refined dress in the shade of sapphire, which perfectly emphasized Caroline's slender, athletic figure and perfectly set off the noble and yet completely natural color of her hair. The wedding shoes, which Jennifer lent to her daughter, perfectly matched the outfit and Caroline's high hairstyle, which she had also made herself. It's a pity I don't have any jewelry at all, Jennifer complained, looking sadly at the girl's festive look. Why not? Michael suddenly joined the gathering and grinned slyly at his favorite women. Dad, are you what? Caroline looked at him uncertainly, and in her eyes Michael read anxiety and worry. Don't tell me you bought something for me. It ended sadly, Caroline said with a smile. I did. Her father nodded with a smile and pulled a small velvet box out of his shirt pocket. Caroline was incredibly embarrassed. Not only had her mother bought her a dress that was simply magical by the girl's standards, but her father had managed to throw away a considerable amount of money for her. Why? Caroline asked him guiltily. But Michael had already reached out to her and put a box in her hand. It's a little miracle. Open it, he said. Caroline opened the lid with a sinking heart. On a white velvet cushion lay a tiny gold pendant in the shape of a star. The five-pointed beauty shone proudly with its rays, even though it was no bigger than a fingernail on Caroline's index finger. Each ray of the star ended in a tiny shining crystal, and when the light fell on the stones, they lit up a myriad of colored lights. "Oh my God, it's beautiful." Mother and daughter exhaled almost simultaneously. Michael smiled and said to the girl, "Caroline, I want you to know that you, for me, will always be a guiding star that will not let me go astray from the right course. You and Mum are my two brightest stars." With these words, the man hugged first his wife with one arm and then his daughter, who clung to her father's strong and reliable shoulder. "Thank you, Daddy," Caroline said through tears of gratitude. "I will never take it off. I will always wear it as a talisman." Michael agreed with his daughter that he would pick her up from school in the evening after the party was over. It got dark early in their neighborhood, and teenagers, when they're drunk, are a mess. You never know what to expect from them. So her father decided to insure the girl in case the drunken classmates suddenly wanted to afford too much. When Caroline entered the assembly hall, where the event was held, many of her classmates quieted down, not immediately recognizing the girl. She looked around, deciding where she could best sit so as not to draw too much attention to herself. When Vanessa suddenly appeared on the horizon, like a shark's fin in the middle of a calm ocean. The queen never walks alone. For some reason, Caroline thought at that moment the first beauty of the class was accompanied by her own entourage, consisting of 3 girls and 2 guys. And the whole company was heading straight for her. Caroline noted to herself that Vanessa didn't wear the desired dress from a famous designer. Apparently, she couldn't fit herself to the notorious beauty standards of the famous brand. Instead, Vanessa wore a perfectly tight, extremely short leather dress, whose coloring was somewhere in the middle between a flesh tone and the color of bronze powder. Good thing it doesn't blend in completely, Caroline thought. Otherwise, you'd think she'd come completely unclothed. "Well, here's our Cinderella," Vanessa said, stretching her vowels. "Cute dress. Did you get it secondhand? It's okay. It's okay. You can wear it once, and then it'll be handy for scrubbing floors." Caroline gritted her teeth to keep from telling her what she thought of her provocative outfit. At that moment, Vanessa noticed the gold pendant around her neck. How lovely. The classmate's eyes flashed, and she reached out her hand to touch the jewel. "Don't touch it," Caroline sharply brushed her fingers away. "It's a present from Daddy," she said with a caustic grin. "It hurts." Vanessa replied with a scornful arch of her eyebrow. "It's just a cheap thing you bought on sale anyway." "If I asked, my parents would give me a dozen of them," Vanessa said. She turned and led the other boys, who followed reluctantly after their leader. Caroline chuckled softly. It seemed that Vanessa's superiority was beginning to bore even her most devoted fans. After the graduation ceremony, the real disco began. Under the influence of good mood, invigorating music and hot drinks, everyone danced. As they say, who can do what they like? Caroline did not dance. She wanted to leave immediately after receiving her papers. But the headmistress asked her to stay and be with the guys a little longer, because it was the last time we were all together. Although Caroline was not particularly eager to continue the evening, she gave in to the headmistress' request. When the slow dance sounded, the hall was illuminated with soft and languid light. The girl saw someone approaching her. The figure emerging from the pink smoke was Andrew, Vanessa's boyfriend. "Hi, Caroline." Andrew began, smiling languidly. "You look really good tonight. Can I ask you to dance?" Caroline was embarrassed. She realized that something was wrong. Why would Vanessa's boyfriend ask her to slow dance? "Wouldn't your lover be angry?" She tried to joke. She couldn't believe that the most handsome guy in the school wanted to dance with her. A slight shadow ran across the guy's face. "No, she won't. I'm sick of her," he rolled his eyes. "All I hear every day is, Andrew, am I pretty, Andrew? Have I pretty, Andrew? Have I lost weight? The scales don't seem to be reading right," and so on and so forth. It became impossible to communicate with her. Caroline held back a laugh. No one had ever portrayed Vanessa so vividly and seemingly. "Yes, she's very fond of herself," the girl nodded. "Okay, but just one dance. I have to go home soon." "If you say so, beautiful lady." Andrew smiled and, making an elegant gesture, offered his hand to the girl. Caroline danced a slow dance for the first time in her life. It was an amazing, unlike anything she had ever felt before. It was as if a whole swarm of small colored hummingbirds had been released inside her, and the tiny birds were flying all over her body, giving every movement of the girl a truly airy lightness. Andrew looked at her so intently, as if he really wondered what Caroline was like. What kind of person was she? What is she like? Immersed in her romantic thoughts, Caroline did not immediately notice a figure with a touch of bronze powder flashed behind her. "Get out of here," Vanessa hissed. Caroline had no time to react when Andrew's strong hands grabbed her by the shoulders and turned her around to face her rich classmate. In the next second, Vanessa spewed a huge amount of tomato juice from a paper bag at her with all her might. Caroline gasped at the nasty, brackish taste. The first minute she was afraid that she had poured real pig's blood on her, like in a popular horror film. "Drink, drink, you cesspit," Vanessa said, pouring juice all over the unfortunate classmate. "You miserable fool. What are you doing? Did you really believe Andrew just wanted to dance with you? You thought he liked you?" Vanessa tilted her head and started laughing like a lunatic. The smoke and the light made it look like Caroline had been doused with something black like tar. Stop it, Vanessa, you're crazy," Caroline shouted back at her, trying to get out of Andrew's grasp. He released her, and she began to shake off the sticky, salty liquid. Her dress was hopelessly ruined, as was her hair. And what was most tragic of all, her mum's wedding shoes. "God, how can you be such a monster, Vanessa?" Caroline asked her in despair. "Why do you hate me so much?" Vanessa condescended to answer, smiling with all her 32 teeth. "It's a joy to hate you. I despise you, Caroline. Because people like you are always trying to get out of your dirty hole, like mice waiting for someone to deliver cheese for them outside. You should know your place and keep your head down," Vanessa said. "What do you think? I didn't see you flashing your legs at our boys in gym class." "What, Caroline?" From the shock, Caroline struggled to speak. "Vanessa, come on. I'm just a good runner. And it's nobody's fault that you can't stop eating fries in packs." Apparently, that last remark had finally pissed Vanessa off, and all the anger and meanness that had been in her until that moment came out. She took a swing at her classmate. Vanessa sharply lowered her perfectly manicured hand and grabbed the chain around Caroline's neck and pulled off the pendant Michael had given her. "Did you think you could be better than me?" Vanessa whispered, clutching Caroline's gold star in her fist. "But I have money and social standing, and all you have is your filthy rag, which you will use every day for the rest of your life to mop the floors of this school or some rundown hospital on the outskirts of town." Caroline lunged for the wretch, but Andrew grabbed her arms, preventing her from resisting Vanessa. Give it back now," the girl shouted tearfully. "You have no right to even touch him. You're the most disgusting person I've ever known. Give me the pendant back." Vanessa held the pendant up to Caroline's face, knowing full well that she couldn't take it away from her. Then she released the chain from her fingers, and the little star swung in front of her nose like a hypnotist's pendulum. "You're a pathetic cleaning lady's daughter, and you'll never get close to being a normal person," Vanessa said in a thick, low voice. "Repeat after me. I know my place, Vanessa, and I'm the pathetic daughter of a maintenance worker." "Go to hell," Vanessa, Caroline said, glaring hatefully at the blonde in the leather dress. The resentment swept over her head, preventing her from snapping out of the feeling of all-consuming anger. "Do it again, or you'll never see your jewel again," Vanessa whispered again. She wanted to throw the pendant on the floor to crush it with the heel of her lacquered shoes. But at that moment, the general light flashed brightly, and the teenagers saw Megan's headmistress looking at them with all the sternness she was capable of. "What the hell is going on here, Vanessa?" she asked the rich alumna angrily. Then she glared menacingly at Andrew, who instantly released Caroline. The girl didn't hold back her feelings and slapped the henchman with an impressive slap. "You filthy henchman," Caroline said through gritted teeth. Then she held out her open palm to Vanessa. "Give it back. What you took, now." "Vanessa." The headmistress looked at her reproachfully. Vanessa put the pendant back into Caroline's palm, being careful not to touch her, after defiantly wiping her hands on her dress. "Megan, can I go home?" Shaking with humiliation and resentment, Caroline asked her. "My dad is probably waiting for me outside." She realized that at that moment she had become an absolute laughingstock in front of all the students and teachers at her school. Megan looked at the girl with genuine regret and said briefly, "Of course, dear, go. Have a happy life after school," she added belatedly. But Caroline was already closing the doors to the assembly hall behind her, and at the same time to this horrible part of her now definitive past. After graduation, Carolina had been in a terrible state. For almost a month, not wanting to go out, she hadn't discussed what had happened with her parents. When Michael met her at the school and saw in what moral and physical state is his daughter, the man was ready to tear and throw. "Daughter, just tell me, who are the bastards who did this to you? They're your classmates, right?" "What difference does it make?" Caroline waved it off. "Forget it, Dad. It was just some fools playing a joke on me like that. Luckily, I don't have to hang out with any of them anymore. I can't even see this school. Let's go home." The distraught father calmed his daughter down as best he could, but he returned home feeling quite upset. His sacred duty was to protect his daughter's own blood. And now this. And Caroline, a light-hearted person, flatly refused to reveal the names of the villains. Michael could not, with all his will, break into the school and shake this information out of the teachers. Jennifer reassured her husband, saying that if her daughter didn't want to talk about it, then there was no need to get involved, so she had to deal with it on her own. Besides, she assured her husband, "Caroline always knows that we are close by, and we will always help her with everything she needs. Our daughter is very strong. If she needs our help, you and I will know about it, believe me." Caroline, meanwhile, was lying on her bed, clutching the tattered chain of her pendant in her hand. It wasn't even the dress or the nasty words Vanessa had said that hurt the most. Most of all, Caroline was tormented by anger for the spoiled gift of her father. She realized that the chain could be repaired, but she didn't want to burden her parents with it, telling them that she had just taken the pendant off and put it back to her. Caroline contemplated her future. Now that the hated school was over, the girl could for the first time consciously choose what to do with her life next. She realized that she had no prospects in this city. But to enter a good university in the capital also required a lot of money. And where to get it from? A regular part-time job. From the backwoods. And Caroline couldn't just leave her parents like that. They needed help, including material aid. The girl listed in her mind what she could do best. But alas, the list wasn't that long. Running, cooking, and the ability to wax floors to a shine. God, Caroline thought, was Vanessa right after all. And I'm not going to get anywhere in this life with these opportunities. Bitter tears ran down her cheeks. It turned out that her classmate, without knowing it, had predicted her future. But Carolina was not one of those who let circumstances overrule her so easily. Therefore, the girl decided to do the following. She wanted to work all next year to save a sufficient amount of money. After that, the girl intended to go to try her luck in a large regional metropolis. There she wanted to take a course in her profession, and maybe, after passing it, find a good job with a decent salary in the center. Caroline realized that it would be a difficult path, but she was ready to endure everything to change her life, thus getting rid of Vanessa's humiliating prediction. Having told her parents about her plans, Caroline sighed with relief. They were not against the girl to try to find a decent job. Michael and his wife were very happy that their daughter finally began to come out of that terrible state. "I will continue to help Mom and Dad," promised Caroline. "But I have to think about my own destiny. I want you to be proud of me, and I'm going to do whatever it takes to achieve my dream." A couple of days later, Caroline took her CV to a recruitment agency. She offered her services as a maid and, if required, she could also act as a cook, preparing simple meals. To her surprise, the call came quite quickly after that. In just a week, the girl was already sitting in front of a female employee recruiting domestic staff for wealthy homes. The woman scrutinized her profile and then looked at Caroline intently in the eyes. "What about your stress tolerance? Can you handle unusual situations normally?" The girl was somewhat taken aback. It was the first time she had ever been asked such a question, but she answered nonetheless. "Depends on what you mean by the word unconventional." The recruiter raised an eyebrow that was perfectly fine, like a thread, and began to curl her fingers. Well, for example, if you are suddenly insulted without reason, from your point of view, raise your voice at you, or, on the contrary, show you special attention, maybe even with elements of a slight flirtation. Caroline gasped in amazement. "Excuse me, do you want to employ me as a maid or, with all due respect, sell me to a not very decent establishment?" The girl realized that after such words she would probably never get a job. But she couldn't help herself. Whatever it was, she wouldn't let anyone humiliate her again. Never. The employee nodded her head briefly and made a note in her notebook. She then raised her eyes to Caroline again. "Well, you answer more or less politely. And your reaction is quite adequate. I will report these points to my superiors so that they can make a final decision. You see, you've had 3 maids leave this place before you, and every one of them felt obliged to tell me in color that they were not warned about how bad it was going to be." "Is that a warning?" I asked Caroline, just in case. "Consider it a warning," the personnel officer nodded. "Expect to be contacted within 3 days. If you are contacted within that time, you are accepted. You will learn the rest of the details of your job on the spot. And yes, I almost forgot. You will be required to live on the employer's premises for the duration of the contract." Caroline nodded in agreement. It was all very strange, but all the more exciting. She really wanted to be hired for this position. The salary was more than generous. There would be something to help her parents. And even if these unusual situations arose in the course of business, she would not give herself an offense. 2 days later, Caroline's mobile phone rang happily, informing the girl that she had been accepted as a maid in the house of a rich businessman. "Mom, Dad, hurrah. I have a job now," Caroline happily announced to her parents. "They said they would pick me up in 4 hours. "I'm going to go pack," Caroline said. Jennifer breathed a sigh of relief and crossed herself. Her husband gently hugged her with the arm that had survived the accident, and the girl's mother slowly lowered her head onto her husband's shoulder. "Here is our girl going into adulthood," she said slowly. "God, I wish she'd do well there." "Don't worry," Jenny Michael held her close. "Remember, you told me yourself that our daughter is a very strong person. She'll get through anything." When it was time to leave, it was not without tears. Her parents saw Caroline off with all the tenderness and warmth of their hearts, expecting her to come back next weekend to share her impressions of her new job. Carolina was picked up from her home 9-story building by a huge black business class UE. When the girl climbed into it, it seemed to her that she was inside a cruise liner, so huge was the space of the car interior. The driver turned out to be a not very talkative middle-aged man, who calmly drove her to the desired destination. When she got out of the car, Caroline couldn't believe her eyes. In front of her stood a gigantic 4-story mansion, made in a completely modern style with glass and chrome metal constructions. Caroline thought involuntarily that the owner of this house must be very fond of shopping centers, if he had decided to live in one of them. She didn't voice these thoughts out loud, of course. Instead, she obediently followed the head housekeeper and housekeeper who led her to the pool, instructing the new employee along the way. "Try not to make eye contact with Oliver when he asks you something. It's best to lower your gaze and answer in a matter-of-fact manner. If you're cleaning a room and the owner suddenly walks in, you shouldn't fuss or pretend to notice his presence. Just get on with your work. Oliver is used to all the servants moving about and working almost silently. You're part of this house, and in a way you have to blend in with it and everything that goes on here. Often we don't pay attention to the owner's little quirks," the housekeeper continued. "We only call the guards if we realize that it could endanger his life and health." Caroline was silent, but she felt as if she were in some modern fairy tale about an enchanted castle where everyone was silent and could not say a word to the cruel king who ruled this high-tech kingdom. The housekeeper's last sentence, however, surprised Caroline somewhat. "Excuse me, I think you said something about quirks. May I clarify what exactly was meant?" The housekeeper stopped and looked at the girl as if she were trying to see through her thoughts with invisible X-rays. "You were not warned by the agency about possible irregularities, were you?" she asked dryly. "Do I understand correctly?" "No, why not? They explained to me that there were some special circumstances, but what were they?" The housekeeper raised her eyebrows elegantly. Well then, you'll soon see for yourself. The woman led her to a large rectangular pool, on the marble terrace of which sat a young man reclining in a sun lounger. He was wearing large sunglasses, a bright red Hawaiian shirt, and white knee-length shorts. The guy looked to be about 24 to 25 years old. Judging by his relaxed manner and the way he was calmly flipping through the newspaper in his lap, he was the owner's son. Pleased, the housekeeper nodded to him. Caroline arrived exactly 10 minutes ago, as the master had requested. After that, the lady silently left, leaving the girl and the young man alone. Hello, Caroline greeted him politely. Excuse me, do you know how long we have to wait for Oliver? The man froze, holding the newspaper half open, and then looked at the girl in surprise from under the shimmering glasses. I don't understand, was all he could ask. Excuse me, but you must be the son of the owner of this house, aren't you? Caroline answered the question with a question. I just can't get used to how many rules there are here. I wanted to ask you about them before I met Oliver, she continued. The young man continued to stare at the maid in mute amazement. She, not knowing what to do in such a delicate situation, just stood there staring back at him. Finally, the man couldn't stand it any longer and laughed loudly. Caroline felt incredibly stupid, but still managed to squeeze out a weak smile. Honestly, I've never had one of those before, he said through his laughter and came close to Caroline. The girl blushed instantly, not knowing if she could back away from him at least a couple of steps. The master's son came so close that Caroline could feel the fabric of his fluttering shirt with her hand. Caroline, that's your name, isn't it? He asked with a playful smile. Did Amanda say it right? Yes, that's right. Caroline looked up at him again. Now, Caroline, the owner of the house is not coming here for the simple reason that he is already standing in front of you. I am Oliver. Caroline stood still with her mouth open in astonishment. Without another word, the young man pushed his glasses back over his eyes, and then strode off at a steady pace toward the stairs leading to his private wing. He threw her a final glance without turning round. I like you, Caroline. You are now definitely accepted. Please tell Amanda and ask her to come and see me when she has a free moment. With these words, he disappeared, leaving Caroline in a half faint with excitement. Caroline told the housekeeper that the master was waiting for her. She pressed her lips together and showed her into the back room, where she gave her all the necessary clothes and the key to her room. Remember, we rise at 6, so you won't be seen or heard. And no matter how embarrassed you are, you must continue to do your job. Do you understand? Understood, Caroline replied, thoroughly embarrassed. Caroline went to her room to change. Thus began the working day for the girl. She soon realized what Amanda had meant when she spoke of Oliver's quirks. It turned out that he loved to host big costume parties with loud music, beautiful women, and expensive drinks. Besides Caroline herself, there were about 15 other people working in the house, and they all behaved as if they were exactly the same things in the young millionaire's mansion, like some floor vase or a painting hanging on one of the walls. It was, of course, very disconcerting to the girl that all the employees of Oliver's house were acting quietly and inconspicuously. After all, Oliver had clearly made it clear to her that he could socialize with them as ordinary people. Amanda, however, continued to insist on numerous rules of behavior even after her host had summoned her to talk to her. Well, Caroline couldn't cross her either. In the first month of work, she received a substantial advance on her card, part of which she immediately sent to her parents. Oliver remained an inscrutable mystery to her. He could easily walk up and kiss one of the young gardeners he paired with her. They were twin sisters and tended an incredibly beautiful winter garden, but at the same time he never allowed himself any flirtations of a certain kind with her or them. For these purposes, Oliver had far more experienced girls who could safely be called mistresses. One named Molly stood out among them. The long-legged, red-haired beauty spent most of her time with Oliver, and he, in turn, increasingly applied the definition of fiancé to her. The entire staff of the house concluded that soon the young people would be married and their master would have a legitimate wife. However, this eccentric rich man had a completely different side. Very often, especially in the evening, Caroline found the young man immersed in the affairs of his company. He would sit for hours at his desk, and sometimes Caroline was sure he worked all night long. She had never once heard him say a rude word to anyone in the household. And if any of the workers made serious mistakes, Oliver always spoke to them in private, locked away in his office. But his fiancée Molly did not share this peaceful coexistence with the staff. She was always picking on everything, shouting at everyone, and the young maids, including Caroline, tried to bring her to tears. "Why are you talking here during working hours?" she shouted at the girls. "Don't you have anything else to do? Look around, dust, dirt, carpets. You're not sweeping properly. Get back to work, you slackers. Well, when Oliver and I get married, I'll get to work on you. How many of you have Amanda taught you? It's all over the place. What are you looking at me for? Look me in the eye when I'm talking." Molly growled at them like a wild tigress, imagining herself the mistress of the house. The maids held on with all their might, unable to endure her terrifying screams and shrieks. God forbid Oliver should marry that Molly, one of the maids complained to her in the kitchen. "Caroline, then we'd all be ruined." "What can she do to you?" Caroline asked her with a smile. "She's not his wife yet. You're not panicking yet." Millie looked at the girl and said with bitterness in her voice, "You just don't know her, Caroline. This is not a woman. That's jealousy and greed combined. Only in stilettos. She'd run us all to pieces, I'll bet. She's jealous of her master's every plate. The other day she complained to him that we were too pretty to walk round the house and charm him with our slim legs." Beatrice and Caroline laughed together, realizing how absurd the situation was, especially when it came to a man like their master. "I can't lose this job," Beatrice continued sadly. "I have a little son in the village with my mother. I work here and send them money so that Matthew will not need anything." "I understand," Caroline said. "My parents have always lived very modestly in another town, so this place is a real chance for me to make a name for myself." Beatrice looked out the window at the full moon hanging over the horizon and smiled dreamily. "Oliver's very good," she murmured, as if in confidence. "He has his quirks, of course, but he's not as cruel as Amanda says he is. I suspect she's made him look like that to us on purpose, so that we'll work harder and not relax." "He is a little strange," Caroline agreed, and looked away from Beatrice, lest she should read into it the feelings that Caroline felt every time she remembered how close Oliver had been to her. He is very young, and for the owner of such a huge company, how had he achieved all this? "He inherited it 3 years ago," Beatrice replied simply. "Since then, he's had these oddities of working non-stop and resting all the time. His father, Marcus, was poisoned at a business dinner. The police were never able to figure out who did it. You could say the culprit is still walking free. And Oliver is very afraid that at any moment he could be next." Really, Caroline was genuinely surprised. "Well, yes," Beatrice nodded. Caroline was struck to the heart. She had never imagined that such a tragedy could have befallen this outwardly light and cheerful person. "I think," Beatrice continued, "that all these parties and phobias, like the fact that he always takes our cook, Kevin, and one of the maids with him when he goes to other cities, are all ways of distancing himself from this personal drama. Oliver, he loved his father so much, he can't seem to get over losing him. And the bastards who sent Marcus to the grave never got what they deserved. I guess it's all hit him too hard," Caroline muttered thoughtfully to herself. Who would have thought that the rich had more trouble than the common people? All the next night, Caroline could not sleep for some unknown reason. Everything seemed to be going well, but her mind drifted back and forth to Oliver. "I wish I knew what kind of man he really is. Maybe this bravado is just a mask, someone more vulnerable, someone she could probably help." A couple of weeks later, exactly what Beatrice had told her about happened. Oliver was going on a business trip of great importance to his business, and, as he always did, he took Kevin, his longtime cook, and his maid with him. The latter, to his great amazement, was Caroline herself. "Why are you so surprised?" Oliver asked her with a slight chuckle. "I need someone I can trust 100% to clean my room and control the food I eat during the trip. I don't think it's a big deal." "Yes, but you don't know me at all," Caroline objected. "I haven't been with you that long. What if I can't do it?" The young man's face took on a serious expression, and then he replied in a voice that sent shivers down Caroline's spine. "Well, if you can't do it, then you and I will have to part. Or we can do it right now if you're not sure you're ready for a business trip. Because that's what a business trip is to you. No, it's not. Of course I'll go with you, Caroline said with her lips pressed together. How could she be so foolish as to think that this calculating businessman could have a soul? If Beatrice was right about his worries about her father's death, he was either hiding them very well, or her friend was mistaken. Because how could a man who was ready in 2 seconds to fire another man standing in front of him at that very moment be worried? No, Caroline shook her head as she left her boss's office. Oliver could be anything, but he's certainly not a bereaved person in need of comfort. When all the things were packed and Caroline and Kevin were getting into one of the 2 large jeeps, one for her and the cook, and the other for Oliver and his guard, Kevin said to Caroline with a kind smile, "Don't you worry so much, my dear. I've been traveling with the owner for years, and it's always been fine. It's only for a couple of days. There's nothing to worry about." Caroline answered the cook with a calm but somewhat detached smile. She herself was pricked by something inside her. A bad feeling plagued the young maid. Suddenly, looking up at the upper windows of the mansion, she thought she saw a familiar silhouette flicker into Oliver's study, for a tiny fraction of an instant. She even thought she saw someone's fiery red hair through the window. But it couldn't be. Molly had gone to some foreign resort the other day, and was not expected to return for another week at the earliest. "It must be your imagination," Caroline said to herself. "You should read less detective stories at night." With these thoughts, the girl got into the car. At first the road was good, and the way through a dense forest seemed to the girl even picturesque. But gradually, the closer they got to the wide stone bridge, the more potholes were encountered on their way. The driver explained to Caroline that the road had not been repaired for a long time, and therefore they had to be especially careful here. "You don't have to explain to me," she nodded, remembering the tragedy that had happened to her own father. The driver wanted to say something else to Caroline, but suddenly he was attracted by something unusual happening ahead with Oliver's car. His business car, which was considered one of the most reliable in the world, suddenly began to swerve on the road. Every now and then his driver was swerving sideways. "What the hell is going on up there?" was all the driver of the Jeep with the cook and the maid could manage to say. When the car in front of him went over the bridge railing at full speed and fell into the water with a loud splash. "Oliver," was all Caroline could exclaim in despair. But then their car began to do the same kind of pretzels. "What happened?" Kevin asked, horrified, his huge blue eyes now huge. "Are we all going to crash now?" "Don't talk rubbish, Kevin," shouted the driver, trying to hold on to the steering wheel. "I don't understand. I just had a full inspection last week. What the—" He didn't have time to finish, because their Jeep also failed to slow down and went full speed into the river after Oliver's car. Caroline couldn't remember exactly how she'd ended up underwater. It was just a protective reflex, and she opened her eyes, being already a few meters into the deep abyss. The cabin was completely submerged. This she realized at once. Sitting next to her with his eyes wide open was Kevin. Blood was oozing from the wound on his temple. And Caroline realized with bitterness that the poor man had obviously been hit when the car fell. He was dead, and so was the driver, who was almost immediately choked by the powerful torrent of water. Being an excellent swimmer, Caroline had good lung capacity, so she managed to get out of the Jeep quickly enough. The girl looked, trying to find the second car in the murky water. Finally, she saw it. Oliver's car was buried up to its bonnet in the mud, sinking to the bottom of the river. After swimming a few more meters, she saw Oliver's hands floating in the water, which she grabbed and began to pull him upwards, away from the submerged car. With great difficulty, Carolina managed not only to pull her boss up, but also to drag him to the shore, and from there to the nearest road. There, Caroline was able to stop the first car she could find and call an ambulance. Until the medics arrived, the girl gave the victim all the necessary resuscitation measures. She felt Oliver's pulse on the shore, and making sure that he was alive, tried to pump out most of the water from his lungs. Although the man coughed up enough water, he never regained consciousness, so Caroline had to carry him on her back to the nearest motorway. Caroline's own lungs burned like they were on fire. Her legs were shaking. She was sweating and coughing. But she was determined to save Oliver. When the ambulance finally arrived, Caroline described the situation to them, and they realized that there was something wrong and called the police. Caroline and Oliver were taken to the hospital, where they received all the necessary care. As the girl was hardly hurt, she was able to visit Oliver after a few long hours, which seemed like an eternity. The man, who by then had come to his senses, thanked her profusely. "You said you couldn't handle it," he said in a hoarse voice. "You not only managed, but thanks to you I'm still alive. And I can imagine what you had to go through while you dragged me through those woods. I'm sorry, Caroline. I'm ashamed of the way I pointed out your place," Oliver said. "Come on, Oliver," Caroline said. "The most important thing is that you're breathing. My teachers at school told me I had a talent for running. I'm finally getting the hang of it. If I hadn't run so much, I wouldn't have been able to get you out." Except what?" Oliver asked her grimly. "Your colleagues Kevin, Nick, Matthew. They're all dead," Caroline said with a heavy heart. Oliver nodded understandingly. "I don't understand what happened at all. The cars were in perfect working order, I'm sure of it." Caroline, Oliver glared at his young savior. "Is something troubling you? Are you ill? Should I call a doctor?" "No," Oliver stopped her. "No, it's not that." The young man reached into his jacket, which was hanging on the chair, and pulled a thick notebook out of the pocket, followed by a pre-prepared pen, straight from the cover. He wrote something on the tiny piece of paper, and tearing it off, handed it to Caroline. "Now you are the only one I can trust." Caroline, not understanding anything, took the slip of paper from his hands. There were some numbers written on it, and the girl counted as many as 10 of them. "But what are these?" she asked. "It's a code. Don't worry, it's not for the safe," Oliver joked. "It's just from my work laptop. The computer is in my office, and I have an unusual favor to ask of you. Please, it will help me understand and solve a lot of things." Caroline nodded, and after listening to her superior's request, she drove back home. Meanwhile, an investigator came to Oliver's room. The policeman interviewed the victim and assured him that they would do everything possible to find the intruders as soon as possible. Intruders, Oliver couldn't believe his ears, so it wasn't an accident. "I'm afraid not," the policeman shook his head. "We have brought the cars to the surface, and judging by the preliminary examination, I have no consolation for you. Someone deliberately cut your brake hose, knowing that you would be traveling in very difficult road conditions," the policeman said. Oliver slowly leaned back on the pillow. "Well, they got to me, too," he breathed out heavily. "Your father's competitors," the policeman said. "I'm sorry, but I've heard about this case. As far as I understand it, they never found who was responsible for Marcus's death." Oliver nodded briefly. "I think it's the same people," he said weakly, feeling the familiar fear that the young man had been so successful at drowning out with alcohol all these years. Meanwhile, Caroline arrived at Oliver's mansion and went up to his office as inconspicuously as possible. She realized that all the cameras in the house had probably caught her, but she hoped that in case the security service was displeased with her, the owner of the mansion would somehow protect her in front of them. The girl booted up the ultra-modern flat-screen computer, then entered all 10 digits written for her by Oliver into the password field. Within a second, a blue wheel was spinning on the screen, and then access to the landlord's desktop opened up. A folder labeled Cameras clicked open. Caroline selected the appropriate date and the Garage tab, then waited for the video she wanted to see to load. Literally seconds later, Caroline saw the garage room. And then, the girl did not believe her eyes at first. A red-haired beauty in expensive shoes and the head of security, the man who was supposed to protect Oliver, entered the garage. He quickly looked around and damaged both brake hoses in the very cars they were traveling in today. What followed was an equally disgusting scene. The red-haired beast, who Caroline realized was Molly, gave her partner a kiss, after which they both left the garage at a leisurely pace. Caroline copied the tape to a flash drive, shut down the computer, and only then called the police. When the investigator and the SWAT team arrived at the mansion, the head of security was already packing his bags, expecting to run away with his girlfriend abroad. But Molly, thinking that their cunning plan had come true and Oliver was dead, had no intention of sharing her loot with her lover. Molly was picked up at the airport as she tried to leave the country. The investigation later revealed that Molly was actually working for the same people who took out Marcus, Oliver's father. She didn't take out anyone specifically, but she was promised an extremely large percentage of Oliver's wealth if he died before reaching the site of his next negotiation. So here Molly had charmed the man closest to him and put the idea in his head that she and he could be perfectly happy if they eliminated their wealthy master. Now Molly and Oliver's head of security are facing a hefty prison sentence. In addition, Oliver's ex-fiancée has shamelessly ratted out her own masters to the investigation. After all, the deal with the police guaranteed her a reduced sentence, while her lover from security will receive the maximum. Thanks to Molly's confession, the ringleaders of the rival company that had ordered Oliver's father were quickly identified. As it turned out, they were longtime enemies of their family, the family of the oldest of the brothers, who'd always wanted to take over their grand business. Oliver, coming out of the hospital, realized a lot and completely rethought his life and attitude to people. The young man first of all forever stopped with parties. In addition, Oliver permanently canceled all the stupid rules and fired Amanda, who frightened everyone. After that, he hired a completely different, kind-hearted woman who could not only manage his household perfectly, but also interacted with all his employees and co-workers as if they were family. Caroline continued her work in the house, but now they were very close friends. Their shared story of saving Oliver's life brought them together, and that was just the beginning. 15 years later, there was nowhere to park in front of the school where Caroline had once attended. The car park was packed to the gills. So many people had dreamed of seeing each other. And they'd all been classmates once. Vanessa, now an elderly woman, and once slim, stood in the middle of the hall with her husband at her side. The seated middle-aged man clearly didn't understand why he had been brought here, but he couldn't resist the will of his wealthy wife. Vanessa began to look even more full and plump than before. But whereas before her fullness had been almost imperceptible and had given her some of the glamour of her lush forms, now everything pointed only to deterioration and health problems, which Vanessa either denied or did not think it necessary to address. The woman could barely squeeze into a thin, sparkling dress, expecting, as it seems, an unforgettable wow effect from her old-school friends. However, those who admired Vanessa, and those who just pretended to admire her so as not to be pestered, could not appreciate the outfit, for the many folds made Vanessa look suspiciously like a sausage. Then a huge black car, gleaming clean, drove up to the school building. All those who were in the auditorium and were actively devouring the delicious food rushed to the window. They were curious as to who was in it. When the doors of the luxurious leather salon opened, a graceful, slender, taut leg appeared. It was wearing graphite gray boots made of the finest suede. Following this, a beautiful young woman stepped out of the car. Thin as a bamboo stalk, but not too thin either. Her body seemed to radiate health and youth, and the modest smile on her beautiful face involuntarily attracted all eyes, like a magnet. "What's going on? What are you all staring at?" Vanessa said impatiently, pushing through the crowd to the window. The woman gasped loudly, and then her face twisted with envy and anger. A few minutes later, Caroline entered the hall, beautiful and blooming like a beautiful flower. Her classmates stared dumbfounded at her gorgeous suit, a tee of English fabric, her flawless hair and discreet but quality makeup. No one could have imagined that Caroline, whom they had all mocked so meanly in their youth, would not only not lose her natural beauty and charm, but on the contrary, become the most successful woman of them all. "Hello, Caroline, how are you?" Vanessa stepped forward. "I see you're doing pretty well for yourself. How much do you pay your beautician? Or are you still doing it the old-fashioned way with a cucumber?" Vanessa laughed, pleased with her joke. However, apart from her, no one else made a sound. "Hello, Vanessa." Caroline greeted her calmly. "I just came in for a few minutes. I wanted to see you all. Take another look at my past. One last time to make sure I hadn't lost anything." Caroline took a few more steps toward Vanessa and pointed to her neck. There, as before, hung her father's gift, a pendant in the shape of a star, which the girl had bought with her first salary. "You know, Vanessa, you haven't changed a bit," the woman told her, enjoying the way her former classmate was literally bursting with envy. "You're still just as stupid, and your jokes are stupid too." Caroline looked at Vanessa from head to toe, and with one last glance at the crowd of her former classmates who had fallen from anger, boredom, and time, She slowly made her way back to the exit, saying one last time, "You see, life always knows who has done how much good and evil. Someone chooses to follow his star or gets a chance to become one of its rays. And someone remains an empty, shiny bubble for the rest of his life, from which the whole shell, alas, crumbles with time. Happy life to you all, boys." Caroline walked down to the door of the school. Her classmates immediately rushed back to the window. Oliver got out of the car that was waiting for her outside. He was still as tall and stately as ever, only now he wore a pair of slim-fitting glasses on the bridge of his nose. He was followed first by a boy of about 12, and then a girl of about 7. The children hugged Caroline happily, and Oliver smiled as he rubbed the heads of his offspring. Caroline turned round and Oliver gave her a long kiss, full of tenderness and love. Then, after the whole story of the cars crashing into the river, he suddenly realized how different this girl was from any woman he had ever met. Courageous, strong, unbending, like a stem of bamboo. She always knew exactly what she wanted and was determined to achieve it. And tender and shy at the same time, pure as a petal of the most beautiful rose. She gave him everything he was looking for in this world and more. When he proposed to her, she told him yes. It was the happiest day of his life. When 6 months after the wedding Caroline told him that they were expecting a child, Oliver finally felt that he was no longer alone in the world. Now they both had a chance to live the life they both deserved, and nothing in the world could stop them. As Caroline and Oliver's car drove away, they did not see how hysterical Vanessa was long afterwards. How she tore at her artificial hair and how she cursed everything in the world, not understanding why Caroline, the technician's daughter, had been able to get everything in this life that should have been hers. Instead, all she had was money, which never made Vanessa happy. Yes, an alcoholic husband who married her just to get a good position in her father's company. Time had not spared her looks. Life hadn't added to her wisdom. And all this Vanessa realized only now, when it was too late to change anything.